Robert Maudsley is one of the longest-serving prisoners in the UK and considered one of the most dangerous. For the last 44 years, Maudsley has been in solitary confinement, 39 of these in a purpose-built glass cage underneath H&P Wakefield, one of the most high-security prisons in the country, where he's not allowed contact with any other prisoners, and during the 1 hour he is allowed out each day, he's escorted by at least 4 to 6 prison officers. The reason for this is that Maudsley is a serial killer who has killed 4 people, 3 of them in prison. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Robert Maudsley was born on the 26th of June 1953 in Liverpool, UK. He was one of 12 children, with their father being a lorry driver, also called Robert, and his wife Jean. It appears that Maudsley's home life was hellish, and when he was 21 months old, he and some of his siblings were taken into care due to parental neglect. Maudsley and his siblings spent time in an orphanage being cared for by nuns, and it appears that this was the only period of stability in his life. During this time, unlike other children, Maudsley did not receive visits from his parents, and in some respects this was probably a good thing, as it gave him some distance from the abuse he had suffered. Unfortunately, at age 8, Maudsley was returned to the family home and continued to be abused by his father. One of his siblings later stated, quote, "It was just the old fella who hit us with his fists, belt and sometimes a stick, but our ma instigated half of it." Maudsley himself said, quote, "All I remember of my childhood is the beatings. Once I was locked in a room for 6 months and my father only opened the door to come in and beat me 4 or 6 times a day." It appears that Maudsley was singled out from his siblings for the worst of the abuse, and he claimed this included being sexually abused by his father. Maudsley alone was then taken back into care, with his parents telling his siblings that he was dead, so essentially cutting him off from any support. In around 1969, at age 16, Maudsley went to London and drifted around the city. He developed a drug habit and attempted suicide on numerous occasions, ending up in various psychiatric facilities where he expressed thoughts of killing his parents. In order to fund his drug habit, Maudsley committed some offences, but also worked as a rent boy, exchanging money for his sexual services. It was when working as a rent boy in 1974 that Maudsley met his first victim, a labourer called John Farrell, in Wood Green in North London. On March 14th, 1974, Farrell engaged the services of Maudsley, and after they'd had sex, Maudsley claimed that Farrell showed him pictures of children he'd abused. Maudsley then took a length of cord and strangled Farrell to death. Maudsley surrendered himself to police, admitted what he'd done, and told them that he needed psychiatric care. Maudsley was found unfit to stand trial, and at the age of 21, was instead sent to Broadmoor. Broadmoor, or to give it its full name Broadmoor Hospital, is, as the name suggests, actually run by the National Health Service, and its role, like other psychiatric units, is to treat the mentally ill. However, Broadmoor is a high-security facility due to only admitting the most dangerous types of individuals who pose the gravest threat to themselves or others. Due to this, Broadmoor's 284 beds are mainly occupied by people who have come from prison, the courts or police stations, having either been convicted or awaiting trial for or arrested for extremely serious offences. On very rare occasions, Broadmoor admits people who have not committed any crimes yet, but are considered a danger of committing serious offences imminently. As it is a hospital, residents are known as patients, and the average stay at Broadmoor is 5 years, although some residents can spend the rest of their lives there. Once deemed well enough, the patient can then be transferred out, whether this be back to prison or to stand trial, etc. Although it's a hospital, Broadmoor's level of security is in line with a maximum security prison, including anti-escape measures, including rows of fencing, security cameras and a 20-foot surrounding wall. Anyway, also resident in Broadmoor with Maudsley was David Cheeseman, a man with a history of violence, including attempting to murder a worker at another high-security psychiatric facility by hitting them over the head with a metal bar. Another patient was David Allen Francis, a convicted child molester. On the 26th of February 1977, when Maudsley was 23 years old, he and Francis played football whilst Cheeseman watched. After the game, Cheeseman asked a male nurse to open a door where they could change out of their football boots, and the 3 of them went inside. When the nurse went to follow them inside, Maudsley pushed the door closed, and Cheeseman barricaded the door with a footlocker. The pair then tied up Francis and proceeded to assault and torture him over the next 9 hours, before finally strangling him to death. Maudsley had armed himself with a sharpened spoon, and he rammed this into Francis's ears so hard it went to his brain. When they finally killed him, Francis's body was held up and displayed to hospital staff who were able to peek in but not enter. Eventually, Maudsley and Cheeseman let them in to a sight of absolute horror. Francis's head had been, quote, split open, exposing his brain, which had the sharpened spoon stuck in it. Whilst this mode was horrific enough, There was a rumour that the spoon found in Francis' head was due to Maudsley trying to eat his brain, which then, through Chinese whispers, turned to the fact they had in fact done this and consumed other parts of Francis' body. However, this has been proven incorrect, but didn't stop Maudsley being dubbed the, quote, British Hannibal Lecter, after the famous antagonist of the Silence of the Lambs book and film. Curiously, whilst found unfit to stand trial after the first murder, Maudsley was considered competent to stand trial for the murder of Francis and was convicted before being sent to Wakefield Maximum Security Prison in West Yorkshire, dubbed the Monster Mansion, due to the number of high-risk sexual and violent offenders who were held there. On the afternoon of July the 29th, 1978, Maudsley, now 25 years old, killed 2 prisoners in the space of an hour in Wakefield Prison. Maudsley later stated he intended to kill 7 people that day. The first victim was a man named Sawney Darwood, who was serving a life sentence for murdering his wife. Maudsley apparently knew Darwood for some time, as Darwood was teaching him French. Maudsley advised him into his cell, and then attacked him, stabbing and hacking at him with a makeshift dagger and strangling him. Maudsley then hid the body under the bed in his cell. Maudsley then tried to lure other prisoners into the cell, but none of them would enter, so he went out looking for another victim. He's described as, quote, lurking on the prison wing when he came across William Roberts, a man serving a sentence for sexually assaulting a 7-year-old girl who was lying on the bed in his cell. Maudsley attacked Robert, hacking him with the same dagger and smashing his head against the wall until he was dead. Maudsley then calmly walked up to a prison officer, dropped the bloody weapon on the table, and told them they would be too short at the next roll call. During his hearing for this double murder in 1979, the court heard that during his crimes Maudsley believed his victims were his parents. The killings, his lawyers argued, were the result of pent-up aggression resulting from a childhood of near constant abuse, with him stating that Maudsley had said, quote, when I kill, I think I have my parents in mind. Maudsley also apparently said, quote, if I had killed my parents in 1970, none of these people need have died. Maudsley was returned to Wakefield Prison and kept in solitary confinement and, as his picture shows, his movements outside of his cell were shadowed by prison officers. He gave one interview where the only pictures of him are taken from, and again, as you can see from this picture, he's surrounded by prison staff. In 1983, Maudsley was deemed to be too high a risk to other prisoners. It was decided he needs to be permanently housed away from them. So a separate prison cell was built in the basement of Wakefield Prison, essentially a prison within a prison. There are no pictures of this cell, but it's described as being 18 foot by 15 foot, or 5.5 meters by 4.6 meters, with walls being made of bulletproof glass so it can be observed from all angles. Within the cell itself is a table and chair, both made out of compressed cardboard, with the bed being a slab of concrete, and a toilet and sink which are bolted to the floor. In order to actually get to the area where he's housed, requires going through multiple security doors. Once at the cell, there's essentially an airlock which has to be gone through in order to stand face to face with Maudsley, being separated by more bulletproof glass, with there being a slot through which his meals and other items are passed to him. Maudsley is watched by officers 24 hours a day. He is allowed out of his cell once a day, but is escorted to an exercise yard by between 4 to 6 prison officers. This cell is described as closely resembling that of Hannibal Lecter in the film The Silence of the Lambs, but Maudsley's current accommodation was built 8 years before this film was released. The combination of the layouts of Maudsley's cell and previous erroneous reports about him eating part of his victims has continued to fuel the perception of him as being the British Hannibal Lecter. However, Thomas Harris, the author of the books, has never stated the character or his prison cell was inspired in any way by Maudsley. Robert Maudsley is now 69 years old, has spent the last 44 years in solitary confinement, 39 of these in his specially constructed cell, where he will remain until the end of his life. I want to preface this part of the video by saying that overall I don't support solitary confinement. It's obviously an extreme measure which causes significant emotional and psychological harm and is sometimes used as a way to simply torment others. An example is the recent unrest in Myanmar, with politicians held in these conditions after the military coup in 2021. However, I'm struggling not to think that in some cases there's little other choice when it comes to extremely dangerous offenders. Maudsley's prolonged solitary confinement has been in the news on and off over the years, including in the year 2000, when Maudsley petitioned the courts for a relaxation of his conditions or, if this was refused, access to lethal drugs to end his life. At the same time, Maudsley was in correspondence with a journalist from the Times newspaper and wrote the following letter, quote, how did I find myself in permanent solitary confinement at Wakefield? I first killed a man outside and found myself in Broadmoor. I then killed a fellow patient at Broadmoor and eventually found my way to Wakefield, where I killed 2 fellow inmates. It's on my record that I served numerous periods of solitary confinement at Broadmoor prior to killing a fellow patient. It's also on my record that I underwent a long period of solitary confinement in various prisons prior to my arrival at Wakefield and placement on normal location. At no time in Broadmoor or those prisons did I receive any kind of psychological or psychiatric assistance or help. Numerous national newspapers and tabloids have labelled me Britain's own Hannibal Lecter, etc. All very sensational, no doubt, and I've received numerous letters from people over the years who have watched this film Silence of the Lambs and who believe it's a genuine portrayal of my life story. They are of course entitled to their beliefs, however a more accurate portrayal will be a film called Murder in the First. I mention this because an important question for these people to ask would be to what extent my conditions and environment and treatment at Broadmoor and HP Wakefield played in causing me to react in such a savage manner. As you know, I don't see any psychologists nor any psychiatrists currently. It seems Wakefield is happy to place me in permanent solitary confinement after killing 2 of its prisoners. Actually, all Wakefield has sought to do since 1978 is to demonise me. He also wrote, quote, "Do we all not form our opinions, beliefs, etc. from how we perceive that environment? Wakefield prison authorities perceive me as a problem. Their solution to that problem to date has been in effect to bury me alive. The cage ultimately for them being my concrete coffin, but is that the final solution? What purpose is being served by keeping me locked up 23 hours a day? Why even bother to feed me and to give me 1 hour's exercise a day, month and year, yet not allow me to talk to any other inmates via their windows? Who am I actually a risk to?" Let me try to briefly answer that by saying I killed rapists, paedophiles and sex offenders. No other type of person nor other type of offender. So my past crime strongly suggests this is the group most and solely at risk. Why is this? I can say that yes, I've been raped, and yes, I've been sexually abused by such people, and consequently, I do detest these people enough to have killed them in the past. I have no previous convictions for killing prison officers, and I have no previous convictions for seriously wounding nor stabbing any prison officers, and I cannot perceive nor can I imagine any situation in which this would arise. Maudsley also told the reporter that he'd asked the courts for a budgie, and that he would take care of it and, quote, "not eat it." The Times article I read from this time is very sympathetic to Maudsley and his living conditions, and the apparent inhumanity of his situation. I looked online at various message boards and comments in response to this article and other articles about Maudsley and his living situation, and there seem to be a lot of people who perceive him as a hero, with them stating that he only killed child sex offenders, so what's the problem? These also seem to be mixed with general anti-establishment messages, including this one from 2000, which I found particularly odd to say the least. This comment describes Maudsley as, quote, "a truly superior, insightful, brilliant, soul-alive philosopher." It goes further by stating, quote, "I honour Robert's choice to speak out to the media and condemn the brutalisation, the inhumanity with which he has been treated. 46-year-old Robert is one of only 26 UK prison inmates who've been sentenced to life in prison with no chance of ever being released. Now Robert is demanding to be treated as a human being, or else he says he'd rather be murdered by the state. All he wants is to be treated as any human being in the 21st century deserves, at the very least. His voice, as published in the letter excerpts, is a cry of sanity in an insane society. In a sane society, 1 million people in England would rise up as one, together, and demand this tortured child victim, who has been unjustly tormented by society for his entire life, be finally treated as a victim worthy of limitless apology, affection, understanding, support, and only benevolent, never punitive treatment." It continues, quote, "I honour your martyrdom, Robert. If there was any justice in the world, you would have a thermonuclear bomb capable of destroying all of humanity in your hands with the launch codes, and you yourself would be asked to decide whether the human race deserves to continue to exist. You're entitled to make this decision, Robert. You alone, based upon the unforgivable lifetime of unjust torment that your society initiated against you when you were a baby, has inflicted and continues to inflict upon you." Okay, that's an extreme example, but I think it illustrates my overall point that I think Maudsley's case has been romanticised to make him out to be some sort of vigilante who only targeted child sex offenders rather than a vicious, dangerous killer. Whilst Maudsley claimed that his first victim showed him images of sexual abuse and that's why he killed him, and 2 of his other 4 victims were sex offenders, one, Stanley Darwood, was in prison for murder, and Maudsley seemed to have no problem with interacting with him before that to learn French. This doesn't fit the pattern and strikes me as something personal. Also, Maudsley was described as, quote, prowling the wing looking for other people to kill. I think it's difficult not to conclude that he was simply looking for anyone to kill. He came across William Roberts, killing him simply because he was in his cell and available, rather than potentially anything to do with his offending. So, whilst it's clear that Maudsley has an understandable hatred of sex offenders, I think that potentially he was just wanting to kill as many people as possible for his own reasons, potentially because of the rage towards his parents and society, due to the fact that he felt victimised and abandoned. I don't believe that Maudsley did what he did to make society a better place. His actions are far more self-centred and selfish. Perhaps because of our natural revulsion of those who harm children, it's been twisted into something more poetic than it is. The question is really, would you trust Maudsley around your family? Was Maudsley failed by society? Quite possibly. However, while sympathetic to this, many people have horrific upbringings, but they don't then use this to justify taking the lives of others. Maudsley had opportunities to be within the general population in custody, but he used this to murder not one, not two, but 3 people. I know the tone of his letter was to try and plead his case and highlight the injustice of his situation, but I can't help but note the self-justification in his words, blaming others for his actions and appearing to link the conditions in Broadmoor and Wakefield directly to his criminality. However, it's a circular argument. He apparently blames Wakefield for him committing the offences, but feels aggrieved that they took issue with the fact that he then murdered 2 inmates, so he blames them for what happened and then blames them for the outcome. He states that Wakefield considers him a, quote, problem. Well, yes, because you killed other prisoners. Ultimately, I'm not sure what Maudsley expects. To be taken at his word that he would only kill certain types of people and therefore should be allowed out in the general population? How the prison service would even manage this is unclear. They would have to basically vet any prisoner who came anywhere near Maudsley to check their criminal record. However, what about someone he simply thinks is a child molester? Would he then kill them? Stripping away all the other details, Robert Maudsley killed 4 people, and therefore he's clearly a man who likes killing others for whatever reason, and who, because of this, the prison service had to build a special cell just for him and surround him with guards whenever he leaves it. In terms of being a martyr and tortured, it's clear that his basic needs are being met. He's sheltered and fed and is allowed out of his cell. The only thing missing is company, and Maudsley has ensured that's not possible due to killing those around him. However, it should be noted he does have visits from family members. To illustrate the continued danger of this man, more recently, in 2022, there was some publicity about letters Maudsley had written to his nephew, in which he seems to have come to terms with being in solitary confinement, where he apparently spends his time playing video games, but he also disclosed that, if he was ever released, he would kill again. At 12:49 a.m. on the 15th of January 2018, the following call was made to 999.
Ambulance service. Is the patient breathing?
No.
They're not breathing?
No.
Okay. And who was it we're talking about?
Lexi, she's 3.
She's 3. Bear with
Yeah.
me. Okay. So she's unconscious and she's not breathing. So help has been arranged, okay?
The woman making this call, 21-year-old Louise Porton, had just murdered her 3-year-old daughter Lexi after 2 previous failed attempts, which left her fighting for her life. Porton smothered Lexi and waited hours to make sure she was dead before calling for an ambulance. Just 18 days later, Porton made another phone call for help as her 17-month-old daughter Scarlett had stopped breathing. Paramedics found that this child too had been dead for some time before help was called, with Porton having smothered her hours before. Porton is an evil, self-obsessed woman, utterly without conscience and remorse, who, whilst Lexi was fighting for her life during an unsuccessful attempt to kill her, was in the hospital toilet, sending topless photos of herself to men, and, when this child died, she was heard laughing at the funeral home. She also begged men for money to drive Scarlett to the hospital, knowing she was already dead. Her crimes, callousness, and likely motivation for murdering her own children is truly sickening, and I have no doubt will appall you. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Louise Porton was born in 1996 and raised in the market town of Walsall, in the county of Warwickshire, in the West Midlands of the UK. Despite apparently coming from a close family, Porton soon developed into a selfish, vindictive, violent and narcissistic child. Those close to Porton later testified in court that the family was close-knit, but she was always an outsider and this was through choice. When the family would visit Porton's grandmother, Joy, she would sit with a scowl on her face in the corner, alone, whilst everyone else enjoyed their time together. If anyone sat near her, she would say, quote, "Go away or I'll smash your face." Porton would also be very vindictive. She would dig her nails into her cousin's skin when no one was looking, causing them to cry, and then she would deny all knowledge of this happening. She was supposed to have never apologised for anything she did. When she was around 11 years old, Joy began noticing that every time that Porton would come round, items of money would go missing. It was clear that Porton was stealing from her grandmother. When challenged on this, Porton would use emotional manipulation to get her own way, telling her grandmother if she accused her of stealing, then she'd never come round again. So Joy would continue to let her come round, not wanting to lose connection with their family, and things would continue to go missing. From an early age, it was clear that Porton was obsessed with money and owning things. She was incredibly materialistic. Her abusive behaviour towards her family meant she was basically cut off from them, something she seemed to be indifferent about. The final straw came in 2016, when Porton was aged around 20, and when Joy became seriously ill and had to be admitted to hospital. It became clear quickly that she was not going to recover. One of her cousins later recalled, quote, "When Nan was in hospital, she was the only one who wouldn't come. I contacted Louise and told her they'd given Nan less than 24 hours, but she said, 'I can't make it.' I told her it was the last chance. She said, 'I heard what you said, but I'm not coming.' I just put the phone down. I was so emotional." After this point, the family cut her off. Porton herself appears to have been abandoned by her mother, Sharon Porton, which was around 11 years old, with her leaving the family home to begin another relationship, leaving their father to raise her and her 2 siblings. This understandably devastated Porton, as she didn't speak to her mother for a number of years, and this separation likely led to a deterioration of her own, already concerning behaviour, which was entirely self-centred, with her quickly defining herself by money she stole and items she bought with her ill-gotten gains. Porton did reconnect with her mother Sharon when she reached adulthood, but the damage was likely already done by this point. While still a teenager, Porton became extremely promiscuous. She's reported to have had sex with anyone who would show her attention. Porton quickly realised that she could use this behaviour to make money for herself, and so would specifically seek out men with means, who, in exchange for sex, would give her cash or buy designer clothes or shoes or handbags, etc. By the age of 18 years old, she was signed up with various dating sites offering sexual services for money, and she would regularly go on Facebook to brag about how much money she was making from sex work, showing defiance of anyone who would call her out for her behaviour, claiming they were just jealous of how easily she could make money. Porton had, it would appear, some relationships that didn't revolve around payment. This included one with a man called Chris Draper. However, Porton was abusive within the relationship, deliberately bragging to Chris about the men she was sleeping with and the amount of money she was making. She seemed to get off on making others feel small. This union, such as it was, produced 2 beautiful children, both girls, Lexi Draper, who was born in 2014, and Scarlett Vaughan, who entered the world in 2016. Chris was estranged from his daughters at the time of their deaths in 2018. This was apparently due to Porton, as, in an act of complete malice, when she was pregnant with Scarlett, she moved to Rugby, a town 40 miles away, and forbid Chris from seeing Lexi. He was not there at the birth of Scarlett, and was forbidden from seeing her. He could only see pictures of her online. Tragically, he never met her before she died. Porton would emotionally abuse Chris online, claiming that neither child was his. However, Porton didn't care about the children. They were merely props, a thing to use to get what she wanted. She took them away from Chris to hurt him. This was all about what she wanted. This is shown in her caring for the children, and I use that term loosely. Porton would spend hours on internet dating sites, including Meet Me and Badoo, offering her services for as little as £30 while she was meant to be looking after the children. Messages recovered after her arrest show that she was bringing men back to the property where she lived. Her and her children shared a bedroom, but this didn't stop her, as she messaged one client saying they could still have sex in the room as long as they were quiet so as not to wake the children. On another occasion, Porton went outside to have sex with a man in a van while the children were sleeping. She was also on various websites referring to herself as a, quote, model, including appearing under the name Lollipop on the website Purple Port. In court, her landlady, Leanne Bradley, said it was, quote, rare for Porton to look after the children, and she would often be asked to look after them when she was out to meet men. It got to the point where they were spending more time being looked after by Leanne than by their mother. When she was around, Porton was abusive to the children, and Leanne recalled in court, quote, they would cry and not always do what she asked them to do. She would tell them to shut the fuck up, or she would give them something to cry for. Porton would also sometimes leave the children with their mother, Sharon Porton. It seemed that she would only reach out to family when she wanted something. At their post-mortem, the children were found to have injuries to their bodies, suggesting that Porton had beaten them before their deaths. Porton would moan to everyone that she was a single mother, struggling to make ends meet and living in poverty. However, she was obsessed with posting pictures of her lifestyle, including shocking trips and various outfits she was buying. Clearly, every penny that she got was used on herself. She had long-term arrangements with some of the men she had sex with, and when she would snap her fingers, they would send money to her account to fund her shopping trips or pay for her petrol, etc. One of the measures recovered after her arrest showed her asking for money for pictures, with her saying, quote, tell me how much you put in and I will do pictures. If you put in enough, we can meet up and I will fuck you. Before discussing the horrific sequence of events that came next, I want to point out a few things. First and foremost is the extreme narcissism of Louise Porton. I've rarely seen a case with someone so fixated on themselves with no consideration for anyone else. Even people I'd met who have been deeply self-centered have a small glimmer of consideration for other people. If a family member was dying, even they would know that they should be there in person. However, if something didn't benefit Porton, then she wasn't interested. Her grandmother, a woman who had apparently been a consistent part of her life, was dying. But who cares? Can't be bothered. All Porton was interested in was money. Secondly is her utter vindictiveness, bordering, in my opinion, on sadism. She was, from a young age, someone who enjoyed causing harm to others, seeing them in distress. Later, she deliberately stopped a man from seeing his own children, purely, I think, to cause him pain. She even claimed that he wasn't the father, an act of pure spite. Likely, this also explains the reason she didn't see her grandmother before she died. She wanted her to be upset that family member didn't come to see her. Porton wanted her to suffer. Lastly, is Porton's complete lack of remorse at any stage of her life. She didn't feel bad about harming her cousins as a child, or stealing from her grandmother. She didn't feel anything when she died. I thought nothing of ripping a man away from his children, or depriving them of a father. It was widely reported later that Porton killed her children as they got in the way of her sex life. This seems to have stuck, as is the angle the prosecution played. But, as I come back to later, this was not accepted by the judge, and is not actually what the evidence shows. The reason why Porton did what she did, in my opinion, was far, far more complex and much more sinister. And I'll highlight this as we go along, and I'm confident that, by the end, you'll agree this woman is pure evil. By January 2018, Louise Porton had decided to kill her children. She began with 3-year-old Lexi. Before finally ending her life, Porton tried to kill her on at least 2 occasions. On the 2nd of January 2018, a call was made to 999 by Porton, saying that Lexi was experiencing breathing difficulties. Paramedics rushed to the property and found Lexi unconscious. She was soon revived and taken to hospital, arriving there at around 1 a.m. Text messages show that during the ride to the hospital, and whilst her daughter was being treated, Porton was sending messages to someone about a, quote, happy ending, and at 1:18 a.m, she was arranging a meeting with a man and telling him he needed to pay cash up front. At around 6 a.m, Lexi was discharged from hospital. In the early hours of the 4th of January 2018, another call was made to 999 by Porton, who said that Lexi was again struggling to breathe. Paramedics rushed to the property again and found Lexi unconscious, lying on her back on the floor. A paramedic who attended said in court that her condition was critical, that Lexi was suffering from severe breathing difficulties. She was stabilised at the scene and rushed to the hospital. Without this intervention, Lexi would have died. The paramedic said that Porton was, quote, not distressed at all in the back of the ambulance, and he stated he believed that she was drinking wine from a glass when he first attended. Whilst Lexi was fighting for her life in hospital, Porton was in the toilet, taking selfies of her breasts to send to people she was arranging to meet for sex. She acted the concerned mother to various men she messaged, and to at least one, she said, quote, really need funds to help me get by. And this, here, is in my opinion the primary motivation for why Porton did what she did. Money. As it will be shown moving forward, anytime she could use a tragedy to turn a profit, she would. Tragically, it wouldn't be determined until after her death that Lexi had been strangled by Porton, resulting in her almost dying on 2 occasions. It seems that Lexi was only in hospital until late on the 4th of January or the 5th of January 2018, and during this time, Porton was making various searches, including, quote, can you actually die if you have a blocked nose and cover your mouth with tape? And how long after drowning could someone be resuscitated? She was also reading articles about children who'd been brought back to life after drowning. On the 6th of January 2018, rather than looking after her daughter, who had just come out of hospital, Porton was offering her sexual services to a man for the entire day for £300. Louise Porton decided to finally kill Lexi on the 14th of January 2018, and, the day before, made further harrowing online searches, including, quote, how long does it take for a dead body to go cold up to the shoulder? She also sent a message to a man saying that a doctor had said that Lexi had flu and would soon pass away. This was clearly a lie. This harrowing CCTV footage shows Lexi entering the family home for the last time, being followed by her sister. Just a few hours later, Porton would suffocate Lexi by placing either a hand or some other object over her nose and mouth. Porton then waited hours to make sure Lexi was dead and there was no chance of her being revived. Only then did she make the 999 call I played at the beginning of the video, which was made at 12:49 AM on the 15th of January 2018. Paramedics again returned to the same address they'd been to twice before in the last 2 weeks, but this time there was no saving Lexi. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Paramedics were concerned, as Lexi had clearly been dead for hours, and they were not convinced by Porton's claims that she'd found her daughter lifeless in bed and called an ambulance straight away. Again, Porton showed no emotion and didn't shed a tear at the death of her daughter. The next day, Porton was back online arranging sex with men. On screen, a conversation was recovered from this day, the 16th of January 2018, and as you can see, she describes herself as a model, but says she's taking a break because, quote, my little girl passed away yesterday. However, within an hour and a half, Porton is talking to another man called Leon, arranging a, quote, date. Porton couldn't even pretend to care, and a few days later was seen laughing at her funeral directors and yawning when discussing the arrangements for Lexi. She also sent a message to a friend, making a joke that she'd gone from 2 children to just 1. On January the 19th, 2018, post-mortem examination was conducted on Lexi, but a cause of death couldn't be determined. It was concluded that death wasn't natural and was unexplained, but at the time, not suspicious. Various samples were sent away for analysis. Unfortunately, the results of these tests would not be returned in time, as, just 18 days later, Louise Porton killed for the second time. This time, she ended the life of her 17-month-old daughter, Scarlett. On the 1st of February 2018, Louise Porton and Scarlett were staying in a hotel, I believe due to some issue with their own property. CCTV footage from 6:55 PM shows Porton carrying Scarlett up to the hotel room, where, likely within minutes, she was suffocated by her own mother, in the same way Lexi had been murdered. There's no doubt that, by around 7:30 PM, Scarlett was dead. Porton again sat with her daughter's body to make sure she was dead. She didn't call for help. Her utter callousness was shown by messages sent during this time. As shown on screen, note that she describes Scarlett as being, quote, not well, and at 9:22 PM, she begins messaging a guy saying, quote, any chance of putting 30 in my bank now? for fuels to get my daughter Scarlett to the hospital. I'll transfer it back Wednesday. So, with her daughter already dead, Porton is trying to get money. I have no words for this woman, I really don't. Finally, confident that her daughter was dead, at around 10 p.m, Porton strapped Scarlett in a car seat and was seen driving. 15 minutes later, she stops at a petrol station to fill up her vehicle, apparently without a care in the world. At this point, she's standing mere feet away from her dead daughter, who is strapped into the car seat. You would think that Porton was driving to the hospital. No, soon after filling up her car, she pulled over and dialed 111, the non-emergency medical advice line in the UK, and said that Scarlett became unwell when they were driving, and then she stopped breathing. Porton then returned to the hotel, unstrapped her daughter from the car seat, and returned her to the room where she'd been murdered. Paramedics arrived at around 11 p.m, and it was clear there was nothing that could be done for Scarlett. She was freezing cold, and her body was stiff, indicating that she'd been dead for hours. So, by the age of just 21, and within the space of 18 days, Louise Porton had murdered her 2 children. The deaths of 2 children, with no significant medical history, just 18 days apart, obviously raised alarm bells. And, on the 2nd of February 2018, a post-mortem was conducted on Scarlett, and a further one completed on Lexi. Various tests were completed, and samples taken, and Warwickshire police were notified, and a murder investigation was started. Unfortunately, a case like this takes time to compile, and Porton will remain at liberty for almost a year before justice finally caught up with her. In the immediate aftermath, Porton showed absolutely no emotion in the days after losing her 2nd child. She was described as going to an appointment with a housing officer on the 5th of February 2018 and being completely calm and emotionless. On March the 20th, 2018, Louise Porton was arrested on suspicion of murdering Lexi and Scarlett and released under investigation. It's clear the police didn't have enough evidence to charge her, but I always think this is a shot across the bow, letting the perp know it's only a matter of time, hoping they'll crumble or make a mistake. However, Porton was unfazed, and sickeningly, in June 2018, she posted an ad on Facebook selling her dead children's clothes. I mean, look at this image. The clothes of her dead children have basically been stuffed into a bin bag and are also strewn all over the floor. I've no doubt this is a reflection of how she saw her own children and how she treated them. Porton carried on doing what she would do for years, arranging sex with men online, claiming to be a model, but also using the death of her own children to make a profit, including selling their clothes. On the 24th of November 2018, she uploaded this disgusting post as a tribute to the children she'd murdered, which reads, quote, "Mummy's angels, take from me too soon, you'll never be forgotten. R.I.P. However, whilst the police were slowly working behind the scenes to build a case, Porton had already been convicted in the court of public opinion. She was subjected to constant trolling, and her response was to post things like, quote, "Fuck the haters." Initially in Porton's corner was her mother Sharon, who I think just didn't want to believe her daughter was capable of these things. But in March 2018, Sharon posted a message on Facebook saying that her daughter had punched her to the floor. Finally, in January 2019, enough evidence had been gathered to prove not only that Lexi and Scarlett had been suffocated to death by Porton, but she'd also tried to kill Lexi on 2 previous occasions. In addition, all of Porton's social media posts and messages had been catalogued. And, on January the 25th, 2019, Louise Porton was rearrested and charged with the murders of 3-year-old Lexi Draper and 17-month-old Scarlett Vaughan, and she was remanded into custody to await her day in court. To no one's surprise, Louise Porton pleaded not guilty to all charges, and her trial started on the 3rd of July 2019 at Birmingham Crown Court. As I said at the beginning of the video, the prosecution framed this as Porton killing her children because they got in the way of her sex life. But, over the 28-day trial, this wasn't the picture that was outlined. Although this claim stuck, it was shown that Porton carried on her sex life, regardless of whether the children were there or not. There was no real change in her activity, before the children were born or after they died. Porton gave evidence, but simply denied any wrongdoing, stating that she loved her children and had no reason to kill them, but her cold demeanour didn't help her case. On the 31st of July 2019, the jury went out to deliberate and returned within 24 hours to deliver unanimous guilty verdicts to the charges of murdering Lexi and Scarlett. The next day, the 2nd of August 2019, Porton stood before Mrs. Justice Yip for sentencing. She described Porton's actions as both, quote, evil and calculated. She stated, quote, "These were blameless young children who were plainly vulnerable and ought to have been able to rely on their mother to protect and nurture them. Instead, you took their young lives away." She said there were no obvious signs of Porton suffering from any mental illness, but that, quote, "It's plainly part of your makeup that you find it difficult to make and sustain emotional attachments and to put the needs of others ahead of your own." She then sentenced her. For the murders of Lexi Draper and Scarlett Vaughan, Louise Porton was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 32 years before she can apply for parole. Porton showed no emotion during her sentencing. Aside from her current prison being publicised, HMP Foston Hall, a women's closed prison in the village of Foston in Derbyshire, little has been reported about Porton's time inside. I imagine she won't have an easy time of it. I have to grow up quickly in this environment. Lexi and Scarlett were finally laid to rest, together, on the 3rd of September 2019, with their tiny coffins being carried in a carriage drawn by 4 white horses, taking them on their final journey. Their funeral was organised by their father, Chris Draper, who said that he wanted to give them, quote, "the send-off you deserved." I cannot imagine the pain this man endured, burying both his children, including one he'd never met. In a victim impact statement in court, Chris spoke about things suicidal after the death of his children. He said, quote, "I am broken. I keep asking myself, why did Louise do something so evil to our beautiful daughters?" He continued, quote, "No punishment will ever be enough, as I'll never get my daughters back." After the funeral, he wrote on Facebook, quote, "Gave you the send-off you deserved. All eyes on you, and you'll be missed, but never forgotten. Sleep tight, babies. Daddy's got you. Daddy will always have your back. Sleep tight. Love, your daddy." I hope with all sincerity that Lexi and Scarlett are safe, loved, and together for the rest of eternity. Rest in peace, little angels. The death of the children also devastated their grandmother, Sharon Porter, and, in a terrible postscript, she committed suicide on the 2nd of September 2020. Friends said she struggled to cope with the grief of losing her grandchildren and the guilt that she raised a monster and had not stopped her. It also appears that she was receiving a lot of abuse for the actions of her daughter. So, Louise Porton's behaviour, her evil, claimed the lives of, in my opinion, 3 people, and irreparably destroyed the lives of many, many more. As I said, despite the prosecution claiming that Porton killed her children to continue sex working, the more I look into this case, the less I agree with this statement. Even if this was part of the rationale, I think it's a minor part, as she was happily going along, doing whatever she was doing, and simply palming the children off on others. Instead, I think the Porton's motivation was, at a very basic level, financial. She killed her children because of money, but it's much more complicated than that. Let's start from the beginning. There's not much about Porton's early life, but it's clear that something was seriously wrong with her from a young age. Whether she was born this way or developed into this is unclear, but it's apparent that she was extremely antisocial and enjoyed hurting people. Underneath her behaviour, I think, was insecurity and extremely low self-esteem, with her using violence to make herself feel better about herself. Quickly, money became a way for her to feel good about herself. Money meant she could buy things, designer clothes, handbags, etc., to portray herself as successful, powerful, in order to hide from the damaged person she was. She began sleeping with anyone and everyone, and this is commonly an indicator of underlying issues with self-esteem, with people looking for validation, even briefly through sex, feeling wanted for that brief period of time, before having to confront how they actually feel about themselves. In order to avoid this, they keep having sex again and again and again, to avoid confronting their underlying issues. Porton realised she could combine the two things. Men would pay her for sex. Win-win. She'd get the validation she wanted, whilst also making money, which she could use to fund her lifestyle. I think getting money to maintain this was her sole purpose in life. She needed money in order to keep the shaky foundations of her pretend life from collapsing. She couldn't stand to acknowledge the person she actually was, or let the world see a glimpse of the damaged little girl she was. She was also horrendously spiteful. Any opportunity she could to hurt someone, she would take. And, by harming them, she felt powerful, reveling in other people's misery. Again, I'm sure this was a way for her to offset her own feelings of inadequacy. And this last reason is why she took her two children away from their father. Out of spite, she wanted him to suffer by not being able to see the children. They were simply pawns to be used. I think she thought little more than achieving this objective. She didn't think, how am I going to raise these children? I think when this dawned on her, she realised she was completely incapable. In court, Porton admitted that she found parenting difficult. I think this was because she'd spent so many years being utterly self-absorbed that she had no ability to care for anyone but herself. If she was struggling, she could have contacted social services, or asked for help, or returned them to their father, or any number of things. But of course she didn't. That would make her look bad. Forget the fact she would have the children, it would mean that she'd have to admit fault. Her carefully crafted image would come crumbling down. So I firmly believe she resented the children, despite her putting them in that situation. They were at fault. They didn't benefit her in any way, and likely, she saw them as a drain on her resources. She was having to spend money on them and devote time to raising them, which took focus away from the most important thing in the world to her, herself. I think Porton then realised that with these objects, because that's how she saw them, out of the way, there'd be more money for her, and sickeningly, I've no doubt that she was going to use the death of her children to rinse people for everything they were worth. We saw examples of this, saying she was struggling to cope when Lexi was in hospital, and needing money for petrol when taking Scarlett's hospital, and selling the children's clothes mere months after their death. The children's bodies were not released for burial until after Porton's arrest in 2019, but I've absolutely no doubt whatsoever that she'd been in charge of their funerals. She would have set up as many fundraising pages as she could and begged for money from everywhere. She would have then paid for the cheapest funeral possible whilst pocketing the rest of the money, which she could then spend to keep on living the life which enabled her to avoid actually looking into the deep, dark hole of nothingness inside of her. I think she only didn't do this because she knew the police were circling, and I have no doubt that, as part of her sex work, the issue of how she was struggling to deal with the death of her two children and how desperate she was for money must have come up. This profile, I think, is more accurate. I would suggest that Louise Porton is what is known as a malignant narcissist, which is a severe condition which combines the traits of several different personality disorders, including narcissism, antisocial behaviour, aggression, and sadism, meaning essentially this type of individual will abuse others without remorse and often take great pleasure in this behaviour in order to get their own way. In the case of Louise Porton, she was willing to smother her own children, something that would have taken minutes, just so that she could maintain her lifestyle and continue to avoid the terror of admitting who she really was to herself and others. Saying that she did these things as the children got in the way of her sex life is a dangerous oversimplification. Louise Porton is a woman who will target, victimise, and kill anyone in order to get her own way. The chances of her being treated are, in my opinion, incredibly low. So, when she's released, I think she'll pose a serious danger to anyone who gets close to her. If she felt in the future that killing a child would help her make gain for herself, she would, without hesitation. But I think by the time she's released, which will be when she's in her 50s at the earliest, she would potentially change her MO. I can imagine her slithering herself into the lives of wealthy men and finding some way to take everything from them. Potentially, if it benefited her, their lives. In this respect, I think that Louise Porton is an extremely dangerous predator who, in my humble opinion, isn't likely to ever be safe to be released. I just wanted to say something about this case. I read somewhere that concerns were raised to social services about Porton's parenting before the murders, but I have literally no information about what their involvement was or the lack thereof. I'd be shocked, given her behaviour, that she didn't flag up on someone's radar. This is the sort of case I would expect to have been reviewed at a national level, and I'll keep an eye out in case there is a report. If I find out any more details, I'll do an update on this case. Anyway, on February the 20th, 2015, Avon and Somerset Police in the UK received a phone call from the family of Becky Watts, who was just 16, saying that she'd gone missing. Within hours, an intense search was started, and desperate appeals were made by her family for information. However, by this point, she was already dead, having been murdered by her stepbrother, Nathan Matthews, a paedophile who had a fixation on petite teenage girls. As if killing her was not bad enough, she'd been dismembered, and the police captured him by the circular saw he used for this sickening task. But he was not alone in his crimes. He was helped by his girlfriend, Shauna Hoare. This evil couple thought they were very clever and had gotten away with murder, but their lies were quickly uncovered, and their sickening crime and their pathetic attempts to manipulate the police were laid bare. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Rebecca Marie Watts, known as Becky, was born on the 3rd of June 1998 in Bristol, a city in southwest England. It doesn't seem like she had the easiest start in life, with her parents splitting up before she was born, and she spent the first few years of her life living with her mother, Tanya Watts. Becky was taken into care aged 3 due to concerns about neglect, before living with her father, Darren Galsworthy, and his partner, a woman called Angie Matthews, who had a son from a previous relationship, Nathan Matthews. Becky had delayed speech and didn't talk properly until she was around 3.5 years old, and tragically, her first proper word was apparently Nathan. Angie said that, although Becky was her stepdaughter, they were inseparable, and she loved her, and raised her as though she was her own biological daughter. Becky also had a close relationship with her biological mother, Tanya, despite not living with her, and they would see each other regularly. However, a lack of support during her vital early years meant that Becky struggled with various issues throughout her short life, including anxiety and self-confidence. Becky went to Sutton Hill Junior School, where her teachers remembered her as a quiet but happy pupil, with one teacher saying, quote, "She was incredibly shy and incredibly quiet, but by the end of year 5, she started to come out of herself." However, it was when Becky moved to secondary school at the age of 11 that she began to have difficulties. She was bullied, and comments were specifically made about her weight. This shattered Becky's already fragile self-esteem. When she was 13 years old, Angie called the local Children and Young People services and asked for help, as Becky was refusing to go to school. Various professionals engaged with Becky. She was showing a high level of defiance and aggression when challenged, and it was clear this was a defense mechanism, as she developed a significant fear of people and places, and tragically, she was particularly terrified about being abducted, as she'd scared herself reading various stories on the internet. Becky also developed anorexia, and her issues meant that she was referred to a child psychologist and an eating disorder clinic to try and help her. In addition, Becky began engaging with the Hospital Education Service, a specialist service providing education for children who have mental or physical health issues, which mean they're unable to attend mainstream school. The combination of a new school environment and therapy meant that Becky started to get better. She was coping better when attending her classes, began to develop friendships, and began doing things that teenage girls did, like going out shopping with her friends and going to sleepovers. However, when she was 14 years old, concerns were raised again when Becky told teachers that she was being pressured into sending indecent images of herself to other boys, and they also wanted her to send explicit text messages. Becky was referred to services to provide support to children at risk of sexual exploitation. Unfortunately, whilst the focus of professionals was on protecting Becky from predatory males in the world, the most dangerous person in her life was someone she knew well, someone she called her stepbrother, Nathan Matthews, a disturbed and predatory paedophile who, rather than protecting her, would end her life. I usually refer to the offenders in my videos by their last name, but as one of their last names is Hoare, using this might distract from what I'm saying, so I'll just use their first names on this occasion. So, Nathan Charles Matthews was born on the 9th of January 1987 in Bristol to his mother Angie. He never knew his father. At around the age of 7 years old, Nathan went to live with his grandparents. Why he moved there is unclear, but it seems he had regular contact with his mother, and then eventually Becky Watts' father, Darren Galsworthy, when the pair began their relationship. His early years seem unremarkable. There may have been early warning signs suggesting the monster he'd become, but none of these are documented. As a teenager, Nathan joined an army cadet attachment at Cadbury Heath in Bristol. He seemed to enjoy this and was seen as a model cadet. During this time, he was given weapons training, but also, importantly for later, was taught how to deal with spillages, including using a product similar to cat litter to absorb liquid, but also cover up odour. Nathan went on to study electrical engineering at the City of Bristol College, before, at the age of 18 years old, joining the Royal Logistics Corps Army Reserves, training at the Maindee Barracks, Cardiff, so basically he was a part-time soldier. It was at this point where warning signs appear to have been noted. Nathan was described as a good soldier, but was also known to be, quote, stroppy, with a fellow squaddy stating, quote, he had a bit of an anger problem at times. He would sometimes snap in frustration and throw things in temper sometimes. It's also important to point out at this point that since he was a child, Nathan suffered from a rheumatic condition known as fibromyalgia, a chronic illness that causes pain and tenderness throughout the body. The severity of this condition varies from person to person, but in Nathan's case, it was sometimes severe and he would often be debilitated by pain. So it seems likely that Nathan was a man plagued by feelings of inadequacy and shame due to his height, with him being only 5'5", and his physical health issues. It seems that Nathan was a petulant, immature man who expected others to do what he said. He wanted to be in control of situations and people, as a way to feel powerful to offset the deep, dark hole of insecurity inside of him. As he got older, Nathan's behaviour in the family home also began to deteriorate. Initially, he and Becky appeared close, but he began to resent her. He was jealous of how close she was with Angie, and he looked for any opportunity to destroy her self-esteem. This included calling her fat, knowing full well that she was battling anorexia. The pair would have frequent arguments, and this included Nathan chasing Becky upstairs, shouting that he would kill her. Becky once told a psychologist that she was afraid of Nathan. However, it was what Nathan was doing in his private life which gives a window into his twisted mind. So from around his mid-teens, Nathan developed an obsession with pornography and would spend hours at a time watching porn on his computer. He had a particular obsession with videos and pictures showing violent sex with females, and especially while they were restrained in some way. Evidence later showed they'd been watching videos where the scenario was men breaking into homes, tying up and raping the female occupants. He was also particularly fixated on legal pornography which fits under the umbrella of, quote, teen, where you have an adult actress clearly made to look younger than she is, so that some viewers can fantasize that she's a child while not getting into trouble for possessing this material. Despite his overt conflict with Becky, it's clear that he was also sexually attracted to her from a young age. It was later disclosed that he'd rubbed Becky's inner thigh in a sexual way when she was 8 years old, and he was around 20, and he'd apparently done this to 2 of her friends who were the same age. It's apparent that Nathan had fantasies about controlling women and little girls, sexually violating them in order to take what he wanted and dominate them, and that extended to how he would act towards his partners. In around 2006, Nathan, then aged around 19 years old, began a relationship with a woman known only as KJ. She later reported to the police that Nathan was controlling and abusive in the relationship, demanding sex whenever he wanted, as well as controlling who she saw and what she did. He would always either need to be with her or in constant contact with her, questioning her on what she was up to. KJ managed to escape the relationship. I do not know how old KJ was, but it seems that she may have been an adult, or at least over the age of consent in the UK, which is 16. However, after KJ left him, it appears that Nathan began looking for teenage girls to start relationships with, and he was looking for those who were particularly vulnerable. No doubt he was doing this because he was sexually attracted to teenage girls, but he also thought it would be easier to control a child. In 2008, he met 14-year-old Shauna Hoare. Shauna Stacey Charmaine Hoare was born on the 12th of February 1994 in Bristol. Her childhood was extremely dysfunctional. Her father left the family home when she was very young, and her mother, Lisa Donovan, remarried soon afterwards. Before the age of 5, Shauna was taken into care due to concerns about neglect, emotional and physical abuse within the home. She was one of 8 children her mother had with 3 different men. Shauna moved from foster home to foster home, never settling in one place for very long. Eventually, Shauna returned to live with Lisa at home in Bristol when she was 13 years old. I don't have the information about what Shauna saw or experienced in foster care, but I imagine that this and her early years at home led to her becoming an extremely damaged child. By the age of 13 years old, she was smoking, drinking, and it appears sexually active, being preyed upon by older men. During this same year, the police received a report that she'd been raped on her way to school, but she refused to give a statement, so no one was arrested. Just a year later, when Shauna was 14, she met Nathan Matthews. How or where is unclear. Shauna's mother, Lisa, later recalled meeting Nathan, stating that he was, quote, controlling and flirty with everyone, sexually orientated, very overpowering. And this apparently included rubbing up against one of her other daughters, who was also a teenager. Unfortunately, this gives an insight into the environment and people which shaped Shauna. She was underage and brought a man round to the house who was around 21 years old at the time, and her mother apparently didn't bat an eyelid. Nathan told his mother and stepfather that Shauna was 16 years old, and despite any reservations they may have had, they tried to make Shauna feel welcome. She became part of the family, to the point where she was registered as Angie's carer due to her having multiple sclerosis. And when she and Darren got married in 2013, she was a bridesmaid, and this picture is truly horrifying, knowing that one of the people in this photograph would be dead less than 2 years after it was taken, and 2 others would utterly destroy the trust placed in them by Darren and Angie and tear the family apart. In order to fully understand the murder of Becky Watts and what happened afterwards, I need to explain the relationship between Nathan Matthews and Shauna Hoare, which began in 2008 and continued for around the next 7 years until their arrest. It was a complicated relationship, which, in my opinion, was characterised by a shifting dynamic that began with obvious one-sided abuse, but then devolved into something even more horrific. I want to be clear that by highlighting trauma in the backgrounds of the offenders in my videos, I'm not condoning their actions. I merely provide this information to help understand the people they were. Trust me, whilst I might empathise with the trauma in their lives, I've absolutely no sympathy for the crimes they commit. With that being said, it's clear that Nathan was abusive and controlling towards Shauna. She was not allowed to buy cigarettes and other items for herself, and had to ask him. When he would buy her things, you would expect her gratitude to be paid with sexual favours. Nathan would also demean Shauna, saying she was, quote, too fat and needed to lose weight. He directed what she could eat and when. He would also abuse her in front of other people, including one time when Nathan told her to, quote, shut the fuck up, you twat, when she tried to speak up about something. During the trial, one of Shauna's friends described Nathan severing the link between them and him making it very difficult for her to see her friends. If she did end up going out to see people, he would demand to always be there, and if it involved a drive, Nathan would demand that the person they were going to visit send him money to pay for petrol. Shauna later described the relationship as follows, quote, I basically spent almost 6 years joined to him. One way or another, it was like I was going to be stuck like this forever, never able to go out, do anything. When she was 16, Nathan gave Shauna permission to go to college, where she wanted to study childcare, but he quickly changed his mind and forbid her from going due to his jealousy about her even speaking to other men. He and Shauna began living together from around 2010. Neither worked consistently and so relied on benefits, and their home, as shown later, was in a state of squalor. Behind closed doors, Nathan was also violent and frequently beat Shauna, with the most serious incident, which has echoes of his later behaviour, involving him grabbing Shauna by the hair and then strangling her for several seconds. If Shauna tried to leave the relationship, Nathan would pull out every trick in the book to regain control over her, including trying to gain sympathy by self-harming, On one occasion, when she ended the relationship, Nathan stabbed himself with a fork and violently scratched his own face. As Shauna grew up, Nathan appears to have lost sexual interest in her and looked for other ways to get his kicks. One way was to ask Shauna to organise a threesome with one of her young-looking friends, which happened several times, with him filming this. However, he'd also tell Shauna about his fancies about abducting and raping teenage girls. Text messages recovered after both of their arrests show the sickening fancies that both appeared to have, with Shauna apparently encouraging Nathan and even trying to procure him potential victims. In November 2014, just months before Becky's murder, Nathan was working as a takeaway delivery driver when he delivered a takeaway to a 16-year-old girl's house. Obviously, due to having an order, he knew her name and began searching for her on Facebook. Messages show that Nathan gave Shauna her name and asked her to message the girl, which she did, apparently to try and convince her to come round so that Nathan could have sex with her. Whether she responded is not entirely clear, but on the 2nd of January 2015, Nathan sent the following message to Shauna saying, quote, "She came into the shop, but didn't speak to me. I didn't say anything to her either, as I was talking to a man. Laugh out loud, awkward." Police recovered a series of much more disturbing messages from the 9th of December 2014, which began with Nathan saying to Shauna, quote, "Fuck you, bring me back 2 pretty schoolgirls then." Shauna replied, "Laugh out loud, yeah, I'll just kidnap them from school." Later that day, Shauna sent Nathan a message saying, quote, "Just went to Cost Cutter and saw a very pretty petite girl, almost knocked her out to bring home, laugh out loud." Less than a minute later, Nathan wrote, "Don't you almost me, now fucking do it, bitch." Shauna said, "Laugh my fucking ass off, yeah? I'll just go back in time to when I saw her, time travel with her to our attic, laugh out loud." Police were able to track down both children and establish they'd not been harmed, but it became clear the resemblance that both girls had to Becky, and, generally, from the contents of his computer, it was apparent that Nathan was fixated with children who looked just like his stepsister. Living in squalid conditions, barely working, whilst watching pornography together, and discussing Nathan's sexual fantasies, the topic of Becky inevitably came up repeatedly. Shauna would later state in court that Nathan said he, quote, "hated Becky." I think there are 2 reasons for this, compared to the bullshit he came up with in court. Firstly, her lifestyle. He was a man who demanded nothing, living in a shit tip. But Becky, the intruder in the family, was a beautiful 16-year-old girl with her life ahead of her, who was starting to overcome her difficulties and live her life. But I think he also hated that he could not have her. She was his sexual obsession, and not being able to have her was driving him crazy. So by early 2015, he devised a plan to take what he wanted by kidnapping and raping her and depriving Becky of the life he felt that he deserved by killing her. Shauna was inevitably a victim in this relationship when she was a child, the girl in the hands of a predatory, manipulative paedophile who ground her down, who spent significant efforts moulding her into the woman that she became. I think the repeated exposure to the sick, depraved man that Nathan Matthews is led to Shauna, who was already a very troubled person, developing horrific, distorted attitudes and beliefs, which meant that she shared his delusions that abducting, raping, and killing children was acceptable, and, like him, probably found these fantasies sexually arousing. This is known as a folie à deux, and is something seen in other killer couples. However, regardless of whatever control and influence Nathan had over Shauna, I firmly believe that he simply built on something that was fundamentally missing within her all along, including a lack of conscience and lack of empathy for others. I think this is shown by her cold and cat-fainted behaviour after the murder. I think looking a bit deeper into her background, you begin to see her own twisted behaviour before she'd even met Nathan. Specifically, people who knew Shauna when she was a child state that she was a compulsive liar. She would pretend to be pregnant and have cancer in order to gain attention. She was fully willing to manipulate others in her own right. I think one point which would likely guarantee any sympathy for Shauna is lost, and further epitomise the selfishness and horrific nature of the pair, is the fact that these two had a child together, a daughter. They themselves were parents. This is detail that doesn't appear in almost any newspaper article, but is confirmed by a serious case review that I've read, and Shauna herself in one of her police interviews. This child was born towards the end of 2012. I've got no other information, but even this speaks volumes. Despite being a mother herself, the parent of a female child, she was willing to help her partner rape and murder the child of another mother. Same logic applies to Nathan. It's clear they both didn't give a shit about this child, risking their daughter growing up without a mother or a father just so Nathan could get his kicks. So regardless of whether Shauna was a victim once upon a time, by the point of the murder she was a willing accomplice, a mother who decided that her and her partner's fantasies of raping and killing someone else's child were justified. The date chosen to abduct, rape and kill Becky Watts was the 19th of February 2015, and it's clear this date was chosen for a reason. Becky's father Darren would not be home, and Angie had a hospital appointment. Becky would be alone in the house. By this point, Nathan put together what was described in court as a, quote, kidnap kit. This included a large bag, stun guns, handcuffs, face masks, and duct tape. With everything in place, this evil pair put their plan into action. What happened to Becky Watts and the timeline can be established from various sources, including eyewitness testimony, police investigation, and even the statements of Nathan Matthews when he wasn't lying, which was rarely. What we do know is on the 19th of February 2015, Becky's father Darren Galsworthy was at work and her stepmother, Angie Matthews, was picked up to go to a hospital appointment at around 10:30 a.m, leaving Becky in the house alone, with her being sat in her bedroom, texting her friends and her boyfriend. At 10:50 a.m, Nathan and Shauna left their home at 14 Cotton Mill Lane and drove towards 18 Crown Hill, Bristol, Becky's home address. This journey would only have taken 10 minutes, but they stopped at a local Tesco's to buy batteries for the stun guns. In the vehicle, strapped into her car seat, was the pair's daughter, who would have been around 2 years old at this point. Becky sent her final text message at 11:07, and it's assumed that Nathan and Shauna arrived soon afterwards. It's known that entry was gained to the house with a key that was left hidden outside for emergencies, and, by his later confession, Nathan put a mask on and went upstairs to Becky's bedroom. Whether Shauna also went up to the bedroom at this point is unclear. Nathan went into Becky's room and attacked her. Becky fought for her life ferociously, and her post-mortem showed that she had 40 bruises on her body from her attempts to fend off Nathan. He wrapped tape around her head and eventually placed his hand over Becky's mouth and nose, restricting her breathing until she suffocated to death. I imagine that, nastiest than he is, Nathan imagined walking into Becky's room, using his army trainings to subdue her, and then forcing her into the large bag he'd brought with him and taking her away to a separate location, no doubt to rape and eventually kill her. But he was as weak as piss, and no doubt overestimates his prowess and had to fight Becky every inch of the way. Now dead, Nathan put Becky's body in the bag and it was taken out of the house. In court, it was argued that, due to Nathan's physical health issues, he would have likely been unable to carry Becky's body without some sort of assistance. Therefore, it's apparent based on this that Shauna helped move Becky's body out of the house and likely helped him put her in the bag in the first place. The bag containing Becky's body was placed in the car boot, and at 12:45 p.m, when Angie returned from the hospital, she found Nathan, Shauna, and her granddaughter in the property watching TV. A few hours later, Darren came home from work. Neither Angie or Darren had any idea that in order to get into the house, they'd walked within feet of Becky's body hidden in the car. Eventually, at around 7 p.m, Nathan and Shauna made their excuses and drove back home, taking Becky's body with them. When they got back to their own property, Becky's body was placed in the bath, and Nathan then stabbed her 19 times with a knife and also stabbed her in the neck with a screwdriver. No doubt this was him taking out his anger on her, that his plan had not worked and she had fought back. How dare she not give him what he wanted? Becky's body remained in the bath overnight, and just after midday on the 20th of February 2015, Nathan was caught on CCTV buying a power saw, the tool he would use to dismember Becky. He then set about this gruesome task. In court, Nathan would claim when he did this, he, quote, closed my eyes, had the saw in one hand, with him implying that he was so disgusted with his actions that he could not bear to look and basically dismembered Becky blind. However, the prosecution noted that there was no damage to the bathtub itself. Nathan was fully in control and methodically cut up the body of his 16-year-old stepsister. That same day, Shauna made searches online, including going on YouTube and typing, quote, "Do you want to hide a body?" Sickeningly, what she was looking for was a spoof video of the song "Do You Want to Build a Snowman" from the film Frozen, which depicts two girls acting out a scene where they place a body inside a rucksack and sing lyrics such as, quote, "Will you help me hide a body? It doesn't have to be in one piece." So these two pieces of shit, whilst the dead body of a 16-year-old child was lying in their flat, were listening to a comedy parody song. This detail shows the absolute lack of remorse of this pair. They were no doubt exhilarated by what they had done, and like typical psychopaths, they obviously thought they were very clever and could easily get away with this. Becky's body was cut into 8 pieces, and her head, left arm, right hand, left hand, right leg and torso were all wrapped separately, being bound tightly in cling film, duct tape and parcel tape. Some of the parts were covered in table salt or cat litter in order to absorb any fluids and reduce the smell of decomposition. Becky's body was then placed inside 3 suitcases. On both February the 21st and February the 22nd, 2015, Nathan and Shauna were seen going to various shops, buying cleaning products to try and cover up the crime scene. Whilst Becky Watts was murdered on the 19th of February 2015, it wasn't until the 20th of February that she was reported missing to the police. This was apparently because her family assumed that she'd gone out on the 19th and then had simply decided to stay over at a friend's house. However, on the 20th of February 2015, Becky's boyfriend and her friends went to her house and said they were concerned. So it wasn't until 4 p.m. on the 20th of February 2015 that the police were called. They began the investigation immediately, and it soon became clear the circumstances of Becky's disappearance were suspicious, as she hadn't got any money with her, no change of clothes, and she hadn't told anyone where she was going. The police began searching the local area, including going house to house and searching open areas, including a local nature reserve. They took to social media, looking for information using the hashtag #FindBecky. On the 23rd of February 2015, Becky's father and stepmother, Darren and Angie, made an appeal for information about her disappearance, as shown by this clip.
She's your typical teenage girl. Lots of selfies, music, fashion.
Becky's father and stepmother told me today that her disappearance is completely out of character, and they are desperate for news.
Bex, if you can see this, get in contact. And if anyone out there knows something, just tell us. Just bring her home safe. If you've got her, then put her somewhere we can find her. We want her home, please.
She's not in trouble. She's just wanted here. We just want her back. That's all we want.
This clip is haunting, not only because, by this point, Becky was already dead and had been dismembered, but also because her son killed his daughter. Police quickly became interested in Nathan and Shauna, as they had been in the house around the time that Becky went missing. Initially, they were considered witnesses, and the police first contacted them on the 23rd of February 2015 to come in for interview. Alarm bells started ringing when both seemed not particularly bothered about prioritising trying to find Becky, with them stating they were too busy to come in. What the police later found out was that Nathan and Shauna were playing for time, as they knew the police were circling and they needed to get rid of Becky's dismembered body, which was still in their flat. So, on the evening of the 23rd of February 2015, Nathan called a friend of his, 29-year-old Carl Demetrius, and said that he would pay him to move and store the suitcases and other items at his home address. The sum promised was around £10,000. Carl then contacted a friend of his, 23-year-old James Ireland, who was promised around half the money to help Carl load the items in a van at Nathan's property and then unload them at the other end. Both of them travelled to Nathan's address, loaded up Becky's body parts in the van, and then drove back to 9 Barton Court, a property just 80 metres away. This was the property of Carl and his 23-year-old partner J. Dean Parsons, and the suitcases containing Becky's body parts were then hidden in their garden shed. In addition, items used in the initial crime, the dismemberment, and the clean-up were also hidden here. All three would later claim they had no idea what was in the suitcases and was simply focused on the money they had been promised, and, when pushed, said they thought it might have been drugs in the suitcases. With Becky's remains now out of the way, suddenly Nathan and Sean had made themselves available to the police, and they were interviewed twice, on the 26th of February and the 27th of February 2015. Both were cocky, confident, and especially related to Nathan, seemed amused by the whole situation, with him smirking during questioning and complaining about his back hurting and how being questioned was hurting his little brain. I'm going to show two clips. The first is part of the first interview with Sean on the 26th of February 2015, which I've had to cut up because the sound goes completely haywire towards the end. The second clip shows part of her second interview the next day.
I think we got there about 11ish. The door was locked, so obviously we used the key from underneath the recycling bin. Got in. Heard music upstairs. Assumed Becky had been in then. I went into the kitchen to get a cigarette and went to go outside to have a cigarette. My daughter started whinging because she wanted to come up with me, so I took her down to the garden to help feed the rabbit while I had a cigarette. Probably was about 15-20 minutes. Then we came back up. I went into the kitchen to get a drink, I think it was, and wash my hands. Then I heard the front door slam. Carried on washing my hands, went into the living room. And then I think it wasn't until a lot later on that Angie asked me if Becky had gone out. And I said, yeah, I heard the door go. She must have gone out earlier. Washing my hands, I think, I heard the door slam, front door. Again, I didn't look at the time or think anything of it, so I didn't really kind of like, oh, what was that? It was just the door, so Becky would have gone out.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I think I've accidentally got this in the wrong order here.
Okay.
You have to clarify this. So, right, let me just go back slightly then, if I could. The door slamming then. You've already said you've got to go from the kitchen through to the living room.
Yep.
So, how far away from that front door would you have been?
But you've got the front door, the living room, and about halfway up the hallway is the kitchen. So I would have been at the sink. So a distance, a reasonable amount, I'd say. Okay.
And immediately before this sound of the door slamming, what could you hear then?
I think it was just CBeebies again, to be honest. I was kind of more, trying to make sure I had vitamins back and getting my drink.
Yeah.
No, I heard stomping down the stairs. That's what made me think that Becky had left in a mood. So I said to Angie, because obviously the door slammed, but I wasn't sure if that was the wind. I took it because there was like quite stomp, stomp, stomp down the stairs. I assumed, she was in a bit of one of her tantrums.
Yeah. And then the only other thing was just a minor thing really, but I think some of our colleagues were trying to speak to Nathan, just part of those initial inquiries just a few days ago on Tuesday, I think it was, and they sort of perceived a bit of reluctance. Do you have any knowledge of that?
Not to my knowledge, man. I wouldn't know, no.
No. Has Nathan had any sort of concerns about speaking to us?
Not that he's told me, no.
No.
Okay. If he does, I wouldn't know then.
Yeah. How is he finding it?
He's found it quite hard, actually. Again, he's kind of more thinking, my God, if it was... Yeah. Or again, knowing how hard it'd be for his mum at the moment. Because Becky was almost like a daughter to her.
Yeah.
When it is.
And over the weekend, have either you and Nathan been involved in searching for Becky or doing any?
No, I wasn't aware they were doing a search. I didn't realise until I think it was yesterday.
Yeah.
I went on my Facebook and obviously there was news articles and pictures popped up about that they did the search, but we weren't told about it at all.
Well, that's fine. Okay, so to Nathan, that's actually a good thing. Where did you guys go then over the weekend? I don't know if you're able to remember that far back.
Well, the weekend that Becky, like after
So
Becky.
after Becky went missing, I think if I help you, so I think it was on Monday actually that you spoke to police officers, like detectives.
Which would have been outside my mum's house.
That's right.
So I would have went to my mum's that day.
So that was on Monday.
I think I went over on Tuesday.
Where did you stay on Monday night? Do you remember?
It would have been at my house, but we didn't leave until about midnight, to be honest.
So that's about midnight
Yeah,
Monday. and
most
then-
nights we did. Tuesday we went over again.
Yeah,
Again, probably would have left about midnight.
yeah.
Wednesday, I think we stayed in my house. We might have gone over again Wednesday, actually. Sorry, I think. Thursday which was yesterday.
That was yesterday.
Yeah, we had the interview, and then obviously we've gone over again
Midnight.
today.
Yeah.
Yeah, because Wednesday we started watching a film or two films that my mum fell asleep, and we didn't leave until like 2 o'clock in the morning or something.
On Wednesday.
Yeah, that was
On
it. Yeah,
Thursday, yeah.
and then Thursday we obviously had the interview, and then today.
I'm sure you picked up on a few things. The complete lack of any emotion, any care or concern. I
I
don't
believe that Shauna has the ability to express these emotions and doesn't understand them, hence why her presentation is so bizarre. I mean, your partner's stepsister, who you know well, has gone missing and you didn't realise people were out looking. I don't know about you, but if someone I cared about went missing, you couldn't drag me away from searching every single nook and cranny.
I'd have pounded the streets every minute of every day. The police also noticed this strange presentation, as well as the fact that Nathan and Shauna's stories match perfectly. Human memory is bad. People can have widely different recollections of the same incident, so having two people give exactly the same story is suspicious, and it was clear they'd both come up with the story and rehearsed it, which was basically they went to the house, didn't see Becky, but heard the door slam, so assumed that she just left. I imagine it was at this point the police knew that Becky was not alive anymore, and they had spoken to the people responsible, but they needed evidence to make the arrest. Police returned to Becky's property and found a small amount of blood outside her bedroom door with a fingerprint in it.
The blood was found to be Becky's, and the fingerprint belonged to Nathan. This was enough, and Nathan and Shauna were arrested for kidnapping on the 28th of February 2015, and, with their in police custody, their house was forensically examined. These photos show the inside of the property that Shauna and Nathan and I assume their daughter lived in.
It's actually disgusting. There's piles of rubbish everywhere. However, the police noticed the bath was actually spotless. By making this one area spotless, it acted like a massive beacon, and the police knew that someone had gone to great lengths to clean this room for some reason, and obviously it would later be discovered that Becky had been dismembered in the bath. The pair had spent days cleaning up the horrific scene. Police also found receipts for the circular saw used to dismember Becky, as well as gloves, goggles, and other items used in this despicable crime. On the 2nd of March 2015, both Nathan and Shauna, who remained in police custody, were arrested on suspicion of Becky's murder. On the 2nd of March 2015, after days of questioning, with all the evidence stacking up against him, Nathan Matthews gave the following prepared statement to the police, which reads, quote, "I, Nathan Charles Matthews, date of birth 9th of January 1987, accept that I am responsible for the death of Rebecca Watts. On the 19th of February 2015, I attended 18 Crown Hill with my girlfriend Shauna Hoare. 18 Crown Hill is where my mother lives with Darren Galsworthy. Rebecca Watts also lived there. Shauna is my mother's registered carer, so we regularly go to the house to help with housework and help with my mother's needs. Although we usually went on Monday, Wednesdays and Fridays, we'd also go there on other days. On Thursday the 19th of February, part of the reason for going around was to return a tin to my grandmother. My grandmother was due to take my mother to a medical appointment and bring her back. In my car, I had a large bag, a stun device, handcuffs, tape and mask. I developed an idea to scare Rebecca by kidnapping her. I wanted to kidnap her to teach her a lesson. I believed that she was selfish and her behaviour towards my mother was a risk to her health. When we got to 18 Crown Hill, we let ourselves in with a key my mother had left in the recycling box. Upon entering the property, we all went to the front room. A few minutes after arriving, Shauna said she wanted a cigarette and went to the garden. I went to the boot of my car and took out a bag which contained the other items. I took everything upstairs to the landing. I think I then took the items out of the bag before knocking on Rebecca's door. She replied, "What?" or "Hello?" and I said, "Can I see you a minute?" or similar words. Rebecca then opened the door. I am wearing a mask. I cannot be sure in what order things happened immediately after she came to the door, but I used the items I had to subdue Rebecca. During a short struggle, my mask slipped and Rebecca was able to see my face. This caused me to panic and I strangled her when she was partially in the bag. I collected the items I'd used, put them and Rebecca into the bag and zipped up the bag. I also took her phone, tablet and laptop together with shoes, some clothes and a duvet cover from the spare room in a separate bag. I took everything downstairs. I put it into the boot of my car. Back in the house, I waited to hear Shauna, then slammed the front door shut. Before going to the front door, I checked that Shauna was not in that room. The rest of the day at the house goes as it would normally if we were there. We leave at around 7 p.m. The rest of the evening passed as usual, but I cannot remember exactly what we did. After Shauna went to bed and sleep, I waited a while, went out to the car and brought the bags into the house. The following day, we went back to 18 Crown Hill and I tried to behave as normal. I tried to behave as normal as I could. When we returned to 14 Cotton Mill Lane, I again waited for Shauna to go to sleep. This time, I collected the bag of Rebecca's body and placed it in the bath. In order to stop Shauna using the bathroom the following morning, I poured drain cleaner down the toilet so I could tell Shauna it was blocked again. The toilet would often get blocked, and when this happened, I knew Shauna would not go into the bathroom. I also locked the door. My memory of the days that followed is not perfect, so I'm not sure which day I returned to 14 Cotton Mill Lane, having left Shauna at her mother's, but I think it was the Saturday. When I got back to 14 Cotton Mill Lane, I tried to dispose of the body by cutting it up with a circular saw. Initially, I wrapped up the body parts and took them downstairs and hid them. I'm not sure how many days later, but on another day, I took the body, the saw, and other items to 9 Barton Court, Barton Hill, and placed them in a garden shed. I took them to this address with 2 other people. I did not tell them what was in the bags and box, and I said I would collect them in a few days. Both these people are men, but I do not want to name them. I've chosen to give my account by means of a written statement because I believe I have mental health and learning difficulties that make it difficult for me to say it out loud. So to summarise, Nathan is claiming manslaughter. He had some ridiculous plan to kidnap Becky to teach her a lesson because she was being mean to his mother. She struggled and he strangled her in a moment of panic. Also note that he's trying to claim Shauna is innocent and had nothing to do with any part of this, which is ridiculous, as I've already hinted at but will return to in a bit. This confession is so stupid. I mean, literally, he should have just written the word derp on a piece of paper and it would make more sense. Anyway, this clip shows around 10 minutes of the interview with Nathan, when the police then tried to question him about the statement he had made. This is one of the most pathetic interviews I've ever seen. This is a man who methodically cut his 16-year-old stepsister into pieces and was smirking during his first police interviews. But now, notice the change in him. Notice the performance, the manipulation. Now he's poor little Nathan. He did a bad thing because Becky was being mean to everyone. Oh, and he has mental health issues and learning difficulties, don't forget. And he's very, very upset. I'm really sorry.
This interview is being recorded at Patchway Police Station in Bristol. It is now Tuesday, the 3rd of March 2015, and it's exactly 12 midday. I'm DC 3302, Marie Stephen, and the other police officer present is
DC Mark Uther 2702.
Nathan, can you give us your full name?
Nathan Charles Matthews.
Thank you. And your date of birth?
The 9th of the 1st, 1987.
Thank you. And the other people present in the interview are?
Robin Rowland on behalf of Crossroads Sisters.
And Liz Warlock, appropriate adult.
Thank you. So Nathan, we've had a short break. Perhaps if I just flag up for the recording what this interview's about. It's about the kidnap and murder of Becky Watts. Over the last couple of days we've had 4 recordings. The last was a very short recording, and I know you needed to have a break then. I explained to you this morning why we needed to, rather than simply take at face value the written statement that you have given to us last night, that we need to explore what you've told us some more. I know that was difficult for you first thing this morning, but that's what we need to carry on and do, and ask you some more questions.
Can you rephrase? I don't know what questions you need to ask, but obviously you said something about Shauna. Can you rephrase it? So you can include basically everybody in it and not use her name. Like,
do you want me to say
I think, yeah,
like
the other person? Is it just saying the name?
Just include everybody in it. Like, obviously she's in. Obviously it will be included in it, but include everybody. Don't say her name.
Okay. Okay. I'll do my best to avoid using that name where I can, Nathan, okay? I can't make promises, and what I would say to you is that I'm not going to be doing anything to deliberately wind you up or anything like that, okay? But we've obviously been here a long time, and if I make a slip up, it may well be because I'm tired and those things happen, okay? Can you tell me then, Nathan, because if we work through what you told us in this written statement, this idea that you had...
Obviously used, I think you wanted more detail,
yeah.
was it?
Yeah, I do.
Obviously I should be able to go into more detail.
Mm-hmm.
Remember the discussion we had before Can We Begin, though?
Huh?
Remember the discussion we had before Can We Begin?
I don't know.
There are a couple of
Are
ways...
you gonna have to read that statement?
No. There are a couple of ways we could get around this.
Obviously, I don't want that to be read to someone.
I don't want to read this out in full again, Nathan, but what I wanted to do was get some more detail from you about things that you've said in it. So perhaps if I could pull out some things from what you've told us and ask you to expand on it, tell us a bit more. Does that sound all right? How about if we start with this idea you had about scaring Becky? Tell me about how that started up then, how you got that idea.
I don't know if it was on TV or something like that, but obviously I had a couple of dreams about...
I think at this point, I can't keep interrupting, but do you remember the discussions we had before you came into interview? And how you and I discussed you dealing with the interview?
What was the question again?
About the idea that you got, and you said it might have been something on TV or you had a dream.
Well, obviously I came up with the idea to scare her, because, like, to try and basically make her more appreciative of life, so she'd be more appreciative for other people. She'd be, like, grateful that, you know, she wasn't harmed or anything like that, or because obviously she'd leave things out on the floor for my mum to trip over, and obviously would talk to her, like saying nasty comments and talk to her like dirt on the floor. And I thought if I was, able to scare her, and obviously her not be harmed, and obviously be released. Obviously when she got back, she obviously would have been scared and more appreciative of things, as people are.
Okay. So tell me what you thought you were going to do. What your plan was.
So obviously stick her in the suitcase. Obviously, put tape around her mouth so she wouldn't make any noise. And then
I don't want to interrupt you, Nathan, but just one thing, it might be difficult to hear this later. Do you reckon you could speak up a bit?
Obviously, the plan was obviously once I got her in the car to make up something to say to Shauna, obviously I had to leave, like to help someone or do something or something. And obviously I was gonna I was thinking of like a wooded area or whatever to obviously take her back out, to obviously still have the mask on, and obviously like scare her and say something along the lines of you've got to start treating people better, not being a bitch or self-centered, and then like make a threat of or this could happen again or worse or something like that. And obviously I hadn't figured out exactly how to obviously walk away after without obviously, if she'd try and follow. I'm assuming she wouldn't have followed because out of fear we wouldn't want to follow someone who just obviously has done that, and obviously would have come back. But I would have obviously chucked away obviously everything first and then come back, and obviously would have acted as normal. That gone back to my mum's, obviously acted as normal.
So when did you think all of this up?
I can't be certain. I'm no good with dates. I've said this repeatedly, and days muddle into other days. I don't have a specific memory of coming up with it, but I remember thinking about it a couple of times. Just basically trying to think of ways to, because obviously she won't listen to me about leaving shit on the floor for my mum to trip up on. She doesn't listen to her dad about it. Just trying to find a way of making her actually listen.
Had you had a conversation with her soon before that?
I can't remember when I last saw her. Like I said in the statement, it could have been Wednesday when we went over, or it could have been the Monday before. It depends on when she was in and when she wasn't in, and if she was in, it depends on when she would have come down.
Nathan, do you think you want some legal advice at this stage, given that this is going differently than we discussed?
I don't know, probably here.
Okay. It's 12:11 p.m.
Pathetic. Absolutely pathetic. The whiny noises that come from this creature, with him clearly trying to gain as much sympathy as possible. Nathan's quote-unquote confession meant that finally, on March the 3rd, 2015, police attended the home of J. Dean Parsons and Carl Demetrius at 9 Barton Court, arrested them both for assisting an offender, and recovered the suitcases containing Becky's remains from the shed in their garden. They also recovered suitcases and a rucksack that contained, amongst other things, the power saw, blood-stained safety goggles, a screwdriver, handcuffs, blood-stained drain cleaner bottles, blood-stained pliers, and face masks. Later, in Nathan Shaughner's property, a stun gun was recovered. Based on the discovery and his confession, on the 4th of March 2015, Nathan Matthews was charged with the murder of Becky Watts and remanded into custody to await his day in court. Shaughner was charged with perverting the course of justice, basically lying to the police about Nathan's movements, and she was remanded into prison, but this was clearly a holding charge. They knew she was involved and just needed the evidence to prove it. This clip shows part of an interview with Shaughner after the discovery of Becky's body, where she denies and deflects and claims no knowledge of anything, no matter how obvious this lie was.
Is there anything else in relation to Becky's body being found at your house?
If they were found at my house, do you know where she was found?
No. Would you know that?
No. It's more of a curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know where he would have hid her, so to speak. I don't know.
Okay. Claire, have you got anything to?
Yeah. If I know that you've said about I wouldn't have any evidence on her, no hair, no skin cells or things like that. But that doesn't stop you from not, because you might not have touched, but you not knowing. Let me try and rephrase this. That doesn't stop you from actually knowing that she was there.
Again,
Do you understand what I'm saying?
I suppose there's no reason that you should or shouldn't believe me. I can just obviously tell you that I genuinely had no idea. I can't even look at him. I was sat in the courtroom today and I just wanted to, I say kill him, that's a bad choice of words. I felt sick looking at him, knowing what he did. And yeah, I didn't always like Becky, but she was a nice enough girl. She was so young.
Shaughner didn't realise that she just walked herself into a trap. By claiming that she had not touched anything, if her fingerprints or DNA could be found on any items recovered, they could prove that she was lying. Also, as already outlined, there's clear evidence of them discussing abducting teenage girls, which the police already knew about. Police got a break when they found Shaughner's DNA on one of the face masks they recovered, as well as on one of the cases containing Becky's remains and on bin bags used to wrap her body. So, on the 22nd of June 2015, Shaughner Hall was also charged with Becky's murder and remained in prison to await her fate. Nathan Matthews and Shaughner Hall went on trial on the 6th of October 2015 at Bristol Crown Court. The pathetic waste of skin called Nathan continued with his fucking ridiculous story. His intention was to kidnap Becky in order to teach her a lesson, and that she had been killed whilst trying to do this. He continues to claim that Shaughner had no part in this. Shaughner echoed this, playing dumb and pretending she had no idea what had gone on. The prosecution had a wealth of evidence to prove their case, that this was a, quote, sexually motivated kidnap plot carried out by Nathan and Shaughner. Their defences fell apart quickly when it could easily be proven that Nathan had a sexual interest in children, especially ones who looked like Becky, and he and Shaughner had discussed about kidnapping a teenage girl. With regards to Shaughner, her DNA was found on items that she couldn't possibly have touched unless she was involved. Also, there was the ridiculous idea that she would not have heard a young girl fighting for her life or questioned Nathan carrying a large, heavy bag randomly out of the property on the day that she visited. In addition, as already mentioned, the prosecution argued that Nathan would have needed help moving the body, and this would have come from Shaughner. Adding to this, Shaughner was shown to be with Nathan during the time he'd been dismembering Becky's body, and not at her mother's. She also went with Nathan to various shops to buy cleaning products, claiming that she didn't know what this was for. Lastly, there was also her online internet activity, including finding a parody song which referenced hiding a body. The case was so strong that it only took the jury 3 hours to find Nathan Matthews guilty of the murder of Becky Watts, and due to her role, Shauna Hall was found guilty of her manslaughter. In addition, both were convicted of conspiracy to kidnap, perversion of the course of justice, preventing the lawful burial of a body, and possession of 2 stun guns, whilst Nathan was also convicted of possession of indecent images of children. In addition, Jadine Parsons and Carl Demetrius, the couple whose shed was used to hide Becky's body, were convicted of assisting an offender, and Jadine was subsequently sent to prison for 16 months. Carl was sent down for 2 years. With regards to Nathan and Shauna, on the 13th of November 2015, they stood before Mr. Justice Dingmans for sentencing. He was barely able to contain his emotions and was later seen to leave the court in tears. He stated that Nathan and Shauna's crimes, including dismembering Becky, were actions that, quote, defy any reasonable explanation. He highlighted the clear sexual motivation for this crime, and whilst there was no evidence to indicate that Shauna had actually been the one to kill Becky, she was shown to be an integral part of this plan. He also said, quote, Mr. Matthews and Miss Hall lied to the family and to the police, pretending not to know anything about Becky's whereabouts at a time when they were in the process of dismembering her. Their deceit of the family was particularly cruel and unusual, and the family's sense of betrayal by Nathan Matthews and Shauna Hall is both understandable and justified. At the same time they were deceiving the family, Matthews and Hall were watching a parody of a song from Frozen, using the words, "Do you want to hide a body?" It's apparent that neither Nathan Matthews or Shauna Hall have truthfully said what happened at 18 Crown Hill to Becky, and I understand the family's sense of frustration about that fact. He then sentenced them. For the murder of Becky Watts, Nathan Matthews was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 33 years before he's eligible to apply for parole. For the manslaughter of Becky Watts, Shauna Hall was sentenced to 17 years imprisonment. Both later appealed their sentences, but they were both denied. People who offend against children are considered the lowest of the low in prison, and some measure of retribution was waiting for Nathan and Shauna after they were sentenced. With regards to Nathan, in January 2017, he was reported to have been badly burnt when another inmate threw boiling hot water over him at the high-security prison HMP Long Lartin. Shauna appears to have had an even worse time than Nathan. In 2016, it was stated that she'd been beaten so badly by other inmates that she'd had to be resuscitated twice. It appears, though, that Shauna survived prison, and given she would have had to have served half her sentence before being released on licence, and taking into account time on remand, she's likely already out of prison or will soon be released on licence to be monitored by probation for the next 8.5 years. No doubt she'll have to keep a very low profile now and for the rest of her life. Nathan has another 25 years before he can even apply for parole if he survives that long. But, given the heinous nature of his crimes, whether he will ever be considered safe to be released is unclear. Becky Watts was laid to rest on the 17th of April 2015 at St Ambrose Church in Whitehall in Bristol. Hundreds of people lined the streets, and, at a request from her family, many wore t-shirts featuring her photograph and threw pink roses towards the horse-drawn carriage which took her on her final journey. Becky's grave was decorated with blue chippings, her favourite colour, and the inscription on her gravestone reads, quote, Bristol's Angel, Becky, Rebecca Marie Watts, beautiful, affectionate, talented, loyal daughter and friend, taken from us 19th of February 2015, age 16. Bex was loved by everyone, will be missed by all who knew her. Rest in peace, my child. Tanya Watts, Becky's biological mother, did not feel able to attend the service, who paid tribute to her daughter by calling her a, quote, caring, normal, happy, lovely girl, as well as saying, you shouldn't have to bury a child. There are lots of people on this earth who don't deserve to be here, but Becky weren't one of them. She should be here. Her father Darren and her stepmother Angie were devastated by Becky's death and the ultimate betrayal of both Nathan and Shauna. Darren subsequently released a statement speaking for both he and Angie, which read in part, quote, "We both feel we are just marking off time until our demise. Everything beautiful in our lives has been ripped from us in one selfish act of violence. The pain cuts deep into our families. It's destroyed long-standing relationships and marriages. Our children have become isolated and bullied at school. We can't go outside of the house without people pointing at us or making comments which they believe we can't hear. When I close my eyes to sleep, I see Becky's death over and over again. I see what they did to my child. I hear her cry out, 'What are you doing?' Then I feel her terror as she realizes they're not going to stop, and she is about to die. I feel her heart racing. I see all this, and I'm powerless to help her. All too frequently, I awake drenched in sweat and physically shaking. Becky was so small and fragile. She never stood a chance. These nightmares consume my every thought. Like advanced cancer, they haunt my days and terrorize my nights. This is the reality of what transpired that day. A legacy I cannot escape. This is my life now." Darren also spoke later about seeing his daughter for the last time, and despite the efforts of the morticians who had sewn Becky back together and wrapped the cuts in bandages, he said he could still see where his daughter had been decapitated. Angie's health declined rapidly after this point. Losing the girl she loved like a daughter and raising a monster of a son who could do this, she completely cut Nathan out of her life. I have no real updates about either Darren or Angie. I know they remained married for several years after this incident, but I'm not sure where they are now. However, what is known is that a beautiful young woman who had so much of her life ahead of her was murdered, taken from this life before she'd even had a chance to live it. She wasn't just taken away from her loved ones, but she was robbed of her opportunity to have a family. They destroyed all the laughter, the joy she would have had, her chance to make a mark on the world, which I've no doubt she would have done. Becky, with all my heart, I hope you're at peace. Sleep well, Angel. It's impossible not to talk about these two together, but I'll also discuss differences in their profiles. Nathan Matthews, in my opinion, is much easier to understand. A sad little man who, likely due to his own inadequacies, including his height, wanted to dominate and control women as a way to feel powerful. He likely felt that on a level, he was no match for a woman, had little to offer them, and they would inevitably abandon him. So he targeted children. He knew these individuals would be more naive than him, and he could mold them into what he wanted them to be. Becky was a precocious teenager who knew her own mind, had a strong personality, and was going places compared to him. A man who could not hold down a job, who lived in absolute squalor. This disparity enraged him. He was also sexually obsessed with her and wanted to dominate her and take what he believed he was entitled to. His plan would enable him to achieve both of these goals, use Becky sexually and remove this object from his life. And I say object purposefully. I have no doubt that Nathan is a psychopath. He has no remorse for his actions, saw Becky and all women and female children simply as things he could use. He methodically dismembered the body of a 16-year-old child and then sat in an interview with the police smirking. Only when he was trying to save himself did he show any sort of emotion, and this was manufactured, a pantomime, with his sole purpose being to sell this bullshit story to save his own skin. Nathan Matthews is a dangerous man who I think will always pose a risk to children. In some respects, I find the profile of Shauna Hall more interesting, as it is, in my opinion, far more complex. I've said what I thought about her during this video, with Shauna being a victim initially, falling into the hands of a manipulative, controlling predatory paedophile who moulded her for years, contributing to the monster she became. However, the more I watch her interviews, the more I'm convinced that Nathan merely built upon something that was already within Shauna, or, to be more accurate, missing from her. She is cold. There is something missing when she speaks. She talks, but there is no emotion there. She's literally like a robot. She shows no signs of distress, and seems incapable of even pretending to care during her police interviews. I think she too is likely a psychopath, who over the years began to become sexually aroused by thoughts of abducting children for Nathan to abuse. The thing that I think cements my perception of these two as psychopaths is, as I said, the fact they were parents themselves to a female child. Especially with Shauna. The coming-on mother appears to have done nothing to change her. She did not then realise the love that other mothers have for their children, and how losing a child is the worst thing a parent can experience. She gave no consideration to keeping that child out of harm's way, or being in their life. No, instead, she allowed them to live in absolute squalor, and took them to an address knowing exactly what was going to happen, and then, likely, had this child in the house where Becky's body was cut up. The same thing goes for Nathan. He couldn't give a shit about anyone else, including his daughter. His needs to indulge his sick sexual interest in children was all that mattered. I've read that Shauna was apparently pregnant again with twins when Becky was murdered. So, again, rather than thinking about the lives inside of her and our daughter, she was slowly focused on helping her paedophile partner end the life of someone else's child. As to what happened to these twins, a report in late 2015 said that Shauna was, quote, no longer pregnant. It's unclear whether she had termination, lost the babies, or potentially she was never pregnant at all, and simply said this to gain sympathy. In addition, I have no idea what happened to the couple's daughter. She'll be around 10 years old now, and I really hope that she's being supported by people who love her, and they'll help her with the emotional fallout when she finds out what monsters her parents were. Shauna, as I said, is either released or will soon be back in the world, and she will have to keep a low profile and look over her shoulder for the rest of her life. And Nathan, he gets to enjoy at least the next 25 years with his new friends. Let's see how that goes. There are clear parallels between this case and the Ken and Barbie murders. This case relates to a couple, Carla Homolka and Paul Bernardo. Bernardo was a serial rapist and serial killer who killed at least 3 young women, with Carla assisting him in finding him victims, including her 15-year-old sister, Tammy. I will be covering that case in the near future. Sidney Cook is a British convicted rapist and suspected serial killer, currently serving a life sentence for horrific crimes against children in the 1970s. However, these offences are just the tip of the iceberg. Cook was a prolific predator who abused children from the 1960s until the 1980s, and was the head of a group of paedophiles known in the press as the Dirty Dozen. These men abducted, raped, and killed male children. Cook is one of the most remorseless, depraved, and disgusting offenders in UK criminal history, who, at the age of 95, is also one of the oldest serving prisoners in Britain. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Sidney Charles Cook was born on the 18th of April 1927 in Stroud in the county of Gloucestershire. Little is known about Cook's childhood, but he later claimed in court that he was sexually abused as a child. This may have been his way of trying to gain sympathy from the judge and portray himself as a victim, or it may indeed be true, but it's no excuse for anything that he did as an adult. In August 1945, Cook joined the British Army, but was a terrible soldier, and he was frequently AWOL and served several prison sentences for this. He was eventually kicked out of the army in 1952, spending most of his time either on the run or behind bars, rather than serving king and country. In the early 1960s, Cook found work as a fairground worker, which would enable him to travel around the country, interact with children, and eventually target them without suspicion. Cook specifically manned a test your strength machine, which was popular with young boys keen to show off. When Cook began sexually abusing children is unclear, but in 1961, he was given a £20 fine for molesting a boy in a cinema. Cook's next confirmed victims were 2 brothers, with the youngest being 10 and the elder one being around 11 or 12. They both came from an abusive household, where there were 9 children in total, with their father being described as an alcoholic, violent bully, and their mother being unable to care for the children. Cook came across the family whilst working at a fairground in 1970, and it appears that this family may also have been from this community, as the offences he committed were across various areas, indicating this family moved around frequently. The youngest boy was abused by Cook for approximately 5 years from the age of 13 years old, being anally raped, as well as being forced to perform oral sex on Cook, whilst also having him engage in this behaviour on him. The older brother was molested at the same time as his sibling for around 4 years, and threatened with violence if he didn't comply. On some occasions, the boys would be taken together to an allotment and sexually assaulted by Cook and a friend of his. Remember these offences, as they'll be important later. How many children Cook molested during the 1970s is unclear, as he targeted disadvantaged families and children from backgrounds of abuse where he could easily integrate himself, molest the children, and then, when the fairground moved on, simply up sticks and set up in another area. Cook, like other serial offenders, was able to take advantage of this nomadic lifestyle and is known to have moved around England, both north and south, going between Oxfordshire, London, Kent, Hertfordshire and Tyne and Wear. It appears that Cook would frequently offend with his associates, who also had a sexual attraction to boys, and, as time progressed, the number of people linked to this behaviour increased, to the point where there were around 12 paedophiles who would engage in these offences, and they became known as the Dirty Dozen. Sometimes there are more than 12, sometimes less, but there appears to have been a core of dedicated and prolific paedophiles led by Sidney Cook, which included the following monsters. Leslie Bailey, known as Catweasel, due to his staring eyes which resembled the title character of the British children's TV series of the same name, was born on the 21st of June 1953 in Hackney in London. He had below average intelligence and spent the majority of his childhood in care. In 1973, Bailey sexually assaulted and attempted to murder a 7-year-old girl. For some reason, the charges were reduced and he spent just 5 months in a mental hospital. In 1979, Bailey followed a woman into a lift in a block of flats, beat her and anally raped her. He was sent to prison for 5 years for this attack, being released in around 1982. Robert Oliver was born in around 1955. His mother apparently hated the fact that she had a son, and so dressed him up in women's clothing. By the age of 14 years old, Oliver would spend most of his time at arcades, where he'd be taken advantage of by men who would give him money for sex. Lenny Smith was born in Wales on the 23rd of August 1954. He too spent much of his childhood in care and was known to be the victim of sexual violence, but also the instigator of this type of behaviour. He was the victim due to his time working as a male prostitute in London, but he would also pimp out other young men and children. Smith met Robert Oliver in around 1973. However, it's not clear when he met Sidney Cook. In 1977, Smith was sent to prison for a year for gross indecency with a child. Aside from the link between Lenny Smith and Robert Oliver, it's difficult to establish when and how these four men met each other. However, regardless of how they met, between around the late 1970s and the 1980s, these men would take the lead in travelling around the country, abducting young boys off the street or hiring child prostitutes, at which point they'd be drugged, held whilst other paedophiles were gathered, and then gang raped. Due to the lack of DNA evidence back in the 1970s and the early 80s, the nomadic behaviour of these men, and the vulnerability of their victims, the number of children abused by this paedophile ring has never been established. Similarly, we don't know how many children these men murdered. Conservatively, it's believed they gang raped upwards of 50 children, although this is likely to be a significant underestimation. With regards to children they murdered, this figure varies wildly depending on sources, but could be anywhere from 7 to 20. The deaths of only 3 children ever led to any charges against these men, with Cook, the leader of the group, only being convicted of offences related to one of them. On the 1st of June 1984, 7-year-old Mark Tilsley met a man on the street where he lived in Wokingham in Berkshire, who took him to a sweet shop and bought him a bag of sweets. This man was Sidney Cook, and the shopkeeper heard Cook saying that he would pay for Mark to go on the Dodgems that night. Cook was working at a local fairground, having set up his test of strength machine there. After finishing his dinner at 5:30, Mark left his home and rode his bike to the fairground. Before he left, his mother told him to be home no later than 7:30, and he said to her, quote, "Don't worry, Mum, I won't be late." These were his last words to her. It appears that by this point, Cook had already set his plan into motion, with him calling Leslie Bailey, and he and Lenny Smith travelled from London to Wokingham to attend a, quote, party that evening. When they got to the fun fair, they met Cook, who had lured Mark away from the main site on the promise of buying him sweets. It appears that Mark was becoming scared and he resisted, and he had to be picked up and forced into the car and driven to Cook's caravan a short distance away. They then met with another paedophile, known only as Oddbod, at the caravan. Once inside, Mark was given a glass of milk laced with muscle relaxant before being raped by all 4 men. More muscle relaxant was poured down his throat, and he was gang raped again. At some point, it was noticed that Mark was dead, but Cook said he was just unconscious and returned him to the site of the abduction. The other men left, leaving Cook alone with Mark's dead body. Cook then disposed of Mark's remains, likely burying it somewhere known only to him, and, to the present day, he's never revealed where this poor child's remains are. When Mark didn't return home at 7:30, an extensive search was started, but no trace of Mark could be found. Unfortunately, it appears that he was already dead by this point, so before his parents even knew he was missing. Mark's father John passed away in 2005, and his mother Lavinia in 2011, with both parents dying before they could lay their boys to rest. On the 15th of September 1985, 6-year-old Barry Lewis was outside playing with his friends when he left and began to walk the short distance to his home in Woolworth, in South London. He never made it home. Barry was abducted by force or lured into a vehicle. It's important to point out at this point that by the early 1980s, the paedophile group led by Cook had obtained a flat, although I've read somewhere there might have been 2, in the Kingsmead estate in Hackney, East London. The flat I found information about was described as squalid and disgusting, and, whilst people did live there, the main purpose was to have a place where children could be drugged and gang-raped. The lead tenant at the property and the main person who lived there was Lenny Smith. Sidney Cook was living a short distance away in another flat in Hackney. All through the early 1980s, there were sexual attacks on children in the area, likely all committed by members of this group. It's to this address that Barry was likely taken after being abducted. Here he was drugged, stripped, and anally raped by 7 or 8 men, including Sidney Cook, Robert Oliver, Leslie Bailey, and likely Lenny Smith. Barry was left covered in blood by this ordeal and was believed to have been dead. He remained in the flat until the next day, when Bailey was tasked with disposing of the boy's body. As he was driving towards the county of Essex, northeast of London, Barry stirred, and it was clear that he was still alive. Bailey then strangled Barry, and, when he was sure he was dead, dumped his body in a field in Essex, approximately 30 miles from the site of his original abduction. His body was not found until the 5th of December 1985, almost 3 months after his abduction. Jason Swift had an extremely difficult life. He was born in March 1971 in Warwickshire, in the Midlands, as one of 5 siblings. The family lived in poverty, and, due to the level of neglect in the household, Jason and his siblings were taken into care. Jason's short life was characterised by moving from place to place, from care home to care home. He also had learning difficulties, meaning he needed to attend a special school. He was described as being both quiet and withdrawn. Jason was once asked by a psychologist if he had 3 wishes, what would he ask for? He stated, quote, money, a house, and food. By late 1985, aged just 14, Jason was in London and had, for some time, been travelling around the city, going to public toilets where men would take advantage of him and pay him money or give him food in exchange for sexual services. He's also thought to have been a regular visitor to the Kingsmead estate in Hackney, and evidence was later revealed that he appears to have known Lenny Smith and was seen going in and out of his flat dozens of times in the months prior to his murder. The exact date of Jason's death is unknown, but it's believed that he was murdered on the 27th of November 1985. It's also not clear how he ended up in the flat on the Kingsmead estate, whether he was there willingly or had been abducted and taken there. However, what is known is that Sidney Cook had arranged for at least 6, but likely many more men, to pay him £5 to anally rape Jason. This included Cook himself, but also Leslie Bailey, Robert Oliver, and inevitably Lenny Smith. Jason was drugged and raped for hours, and at some point during this ordeal he died, likely by being suffocated, with something being placed over his nose and mouth deliberately. Jason's body was then taken and dumped in a copse near a place called Stapleford Tawney in Essex, approximately 20 miles away from the site of his murder, where it was discovered on the 30th of November 1985 by a farm worker. Although he was killed after Barry Lewis, Jason's body was recovered 5 days beforehand, and the deposition sites were around 10 miles apart. Autopsies on the bodies of both Jason Swift and Barry Lewis show police that both had sustained horrific injuries from being raped by multiple men, showing them not after one man, but a group of men. Also, it was clear around the same time, in the same area, men were offering their services as babysitters in order to gain access to children to rape, and this included Leslie Bailey, Robert Oliver, and Lenny Smith. In January 1986, the police therefore began a task force investigating the offences of this paedophile ring. Over the course of 1986 and 1987, the police interviewed thousands of witnesses and people of interest and compiled thousands of pages of evidence and intelligence. As time progressed, each of the main group members was arrested. Initially, they were detained for various sex offences, and this included Sidney Cook and Lenny Smith, who were both arrested in February 1986, related to the sexual assault of a 13-year-old boy. Whilst in prison on remand for this offence, Cook would boast about raping children and the murder of Jason Swift. He would go into graphic detail about raping and killing boys, with him saying he killed many of them. The prisoners were so disgusted that they contacted the police to tell them what they'd learnt. In June 1987, Robert Oliver was arrested and charged with abusing children whilst posing as a babysitter. Oliver was questioned about the death of Jason Swift and confessed that he knew him through Cook and Smith, therefore forming the link between them. In July 1987, Leslie Bailey was arrested and soon confessed to being present on the day that Jason died, raping him and being complicit in his death. He named all of the men that were present. This same month, Sidney Cook was confronted with all the evidence whilst in prison, and he admitted raping Jason, but claimed that he'd simply been invited to a, quote, gangbang, organised by someone else, and he was not responsible for his death. He said that Lenny Smith had brought Jason to the property originally. By 1988, enough evidence had been obtained to charge all 4 men with raping and murdering Jason Swift. Unfortunately, by the time of the trial in 1989, charges against Lenny Smith had been dropped due to lack of evidence. It's really unclear why this happened, as there were multiple witnesses who saw Jason going in and out of his property in the months before he died. Bailey and Cook had also admitted he was there and involved, and Cook even said he was the one who brought Jason to the property. As if this wasn't worse enough, after long, quote, legal arguments, the charge of murder was dropped and replaced by one of manslaughter, so acknowledging that Jason had died during the sexual assault on him, but this was not deliberate, and that he'd been suffocated accidentally during this abuse. The men were convicted on this basis. On the 12th of May 1989, the men were sentenced. Sidney Cook was sentenced to 19 years in prison. Leslie Bailey was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Robert Oliver was also sentenced to 15 years in prison. The police continued to investigate the abduction, rape and murder of children. In 1990, Leslie Bailey confessed to police that he'd raped and murdered Barry Lewis, and that he'd raped Mark Tilsley, and was therefore involved in the incident which had led to his death. He gave detailed confessions about who was involved in these crimes, as well as outlining multiple other offences committed by the group. He stated that there were at least 8 burial sites dotted around the south of England where victims were buried, but was vague with the details, and none of these sites were located. It appears that in May 1991, the police began a series of 64 interviews with Sidney Cook whilst he was in prison. During these interactions, he apparently went into minute detail about raping Barry Lewis, clearly taking great glee in reliving the experience. However, despite Leslie Bailey's confession and Cook's admission, no one else was charged with these murders, which seems absolutely ridiculous to me. What led to this decision was the fact that Leslie Bailey had significant underlying cognitive and emotional issues, and this, coupled with the fact that he was a child rapist, meant he was not considered a credible witness. In addition to this, Cook subsequently withdrew his confession to raping Barry, and there was little other evidence, so there was not enough to charge anyone else with the offences related to Mark and Barry. So Bailey stood alone in the dock when on the 14th of June 1991, he pleaded guilty to murdering and raping Barry Lewis, and on the 22nd of October 1992, he pleaded guilty to the manslaughter and rape of Mark Tildesley. Leslie Bailey was sentenced to life in prison for his crimes, but I don't have any information about how long he was meant to serve before he could apply for parole. However, it doesn't matter, as Bailey would never see freedom again, and his time in prison was short. On October the 7th, 1993, he was found dead in his cell at H&P Whitemoor, a Category A prison in Cambridgeshire. He'd been murdered, strangled to death by 2 inmates as retribution for his crimes. Before turning to what has become of Sidney Cook, I want to look at the fates of the other men involved in this case. It's clear that Lenny Smith essentially escaped justice for his part in the murders of children. However, he did not ride off into the sunset. A prolific and dangerous sex offender, he was eventually sent to prison for 10 years in 1992 for a string of horrific sex offences against a 6-year-old boy he was babysitting. He was released from prison in June 1999, but requested to be placed in a secure housing block for offenders next to Nottingham Prison. It appears this was a housing block where serious offenders would go to before moving on to another property, but Smith never left there. It seems that the crimes of the Dirty Dozen had been well publicised by this point, and the community was in uproar about any of these men ever seeing freedom again. Smith likely knew that if he stepped out into the real world, he would be murdered. This was a well-founded concern, given that Leslie Bailey had already been murdered, but also a man named Bill Malcolm was murdered in February 2000. He was living in a property in East London when someone knocked on the door. When he opened it, he was shot at point-blank range in the head. Malcolm was an associate of the Dirty Dozen, but I'm unsure exactly what offences he was involved in with them. However, his record is described as appalling in and of itself, and it included him raping a 6-year-old girl. Then, when he was released from prison, tracking her down and raping her again, while saying, quote, "You put me away, you bitch." It's believed this was an organised hit by gangs who felt he deserved to die for his crimes. No one mourned his passing. So Lenny Smith, likely fearing he would suffer the same fate, lived in this property attached to the prison, apparently leaving only once or twice for 7 years until his death from AIDS in 2006. Robert Oliver served his original sentence and was released, apparently changing his name. Due to his crimes, he was required to register as a sex offender and have restrictions about having contact with children, i.e. he shouldn't have any at all ever. In July 2013, he was jailed for 3 years for breaching these conditions, as he'd apparently gone into a household with children and sent a birthday card to a 1-year-old. He was released in 2014 and is apparently still alive, but probably with a new name. So what became of Sidney Cook? Sickeningly, his sentence of 19 years was reduced by the Court of Appeal to 16 years in 1992, as he was able to argue that, due to Leslie Bailey's confessions, he must have been the leader of the group. He was just following. Why this made a difference, I do not know. However, the police knew that he was the ringleader. This meant that Cook would be released in 1998. During his time in prison, Cook showed no remorse and refused to undertake any rehabilitation programs. In fact, he revelled in his offending and was seen as a celebrity by other paedophiles. He would describe in graphic detail how he'd raped and murdered children, claiming he killed between 15 and 20. The public was well aware of how dangerous Cook was, and so, when he was released on the 6th of April 1998, they were waiting for him. Despite changing his name to Sidney Lomas, Cook was easily recognisable, and it was clear that if someone got their hands on him, they would tear him limb from limb. Cook was housed at Yeovil Police Station in Somerset for his own protection, and stayed there for 9 months, not leaving the premises. The police knew they had an extremely dangerous child rapist and murderer now released. It was only a matter of time until he began offending. They needed something, anything, to hang on him, to get him off the streets forever. Luckily, they got a break. They were able to obtain statements from the two brothers I mentioned at the beginning of the video, who Cook abused for years in the 1970s. Based on this, on the 20th of April 1999, just over a year after his release, Sidney Cook was charged with 18 sexual offences against these children, including rape and sexual assault. During his police interview, he admitted the offences, and showing his disgusting, distorted thinking, he told the officers that the reason why he'd performed oral sex on one of the boys, after he'd forced this child to do this to him, was because, quote, he gave me entertainment, and I returned the compliment. Sidney Cook was remanded to custody after being arrested, and on the 17th of December 1999, he appeared at Wolverhampton Crown Court before Judge David Poole for sentencing, having pleaded guilty to the offences for which he was charged. Judge Poole stated, quote, "The reports before me are unanimous, that notwithstanding your advancing years, you remain for the time being, and will remain for an incalculable period, a serious danger to children." He then sentenced him. Sidney Cook was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 5 years before he could apply for parole. Sidney Cook has been eligible to apply for parole from around 2004, and at the time of recording, this has been refused 10 times, most recently in October 2021. He was back in the papers again in October 2022, when a story appeared about him making an appeal to get his freedom. Obviously, a story like this produces panic, and I sometimes wonder whether the authors are just ignorant of how things work, or know and just want to be sensationalist. Basically, prisoners on life sentences can apply for parole at regular intervals. This is reviewed by the parole board. This happens maybe once a year or once every 2 years. The parole board can decide to release them back into the world, move them to open conditions, which is a less restrictive environment, or refuse either of these two things. Cook has been denied either release or a move to open prisons since he first became eligible for parole and remains in the Monster Mansion, H&P Wakefield, a cash VA prison which houses some of the country's most dangerous offenders. The fact he still remains in this environment and has not been moved to a lower security prison for his entire time in custody shows what the authorities think of him. Sidney Cook can apply for release until the cows come home, but he'll never be released. And, at the age of 95, he's hopefully coming to the end of his miserable life, and the next headline will be about his death. Sidney Cook is one of the most prolific and remorseless child sex offenders and murderers the UK has ever seen, and that is just what we know. Unfortunately, Cook committed his offences at a time when there were no CCTV cameras, and our understanding of DNA was still in its infancy. He was a calculating and predatory sex offender, travelling the length and breadth of the country abusing children. I've no doubt that he specifically chose working at a fairground, knowing this would attract little boys who he could then abuse before packing up and moving on to a new site quickly without anyone batting an eyelid. His type of victim was not arbitrary either. Cook targeted children he knew had fallen through the cracks in society, like Jason Swift, a lost young man who was already being abused by predatory men when all he wanted was a roof over his head and food in his belly. Sidney Cook is a man who devoted his whole life to the abuse of children. He was inevitably a sexual psychopath. I've no doubt that he got sexual gratification from hearing the screams of his victims. He also saw that he could make money from this, and so got men to pay him to rape the children he obtained. The men who he committed these offences with were no less evil. All of them were deeply disturbed, horrific excuses for human beings. Together, these men, and all of the others involved, formed an unholy alliance intent on meeting their disgusting sexual need to abuse young boys, destroying their bodies, and for those they did not kill, inflicting wounds so deep psychologically and emotionally that I wouldn't be surprised if some of the people they abused and let live committed suicide afterwards, or struggled with being able to cope in their life until this very day. People who victimise children are cowards, pure and simple, but Cook existed in a world surrounded by pathetic cowards, and gained a sense of celebrity from these pathetic sycophants. All through his time in prison, it appears he wanted recognition and praise for the things he had done. I've read that Cook is a remorseless and arrogant man, and imagine that if you sat down with him, he would sit there with a smirk on his face, just asking for a kicking. The most heartbreaking part of this story is just how little we know about the crimes of Cook and the so-called Dirty Dozen. Several men I haven't mentioned were convicted of their part in this paedophile ring, but the majority were never identified and never prosecuted. This lack of knowledge also means the identities of all the children they murdered will never be known. Each one of these victims represents a life that was snatched away before it even begun, but also a family who never knew what happened to their loved one, or, even worse, because of the type of children he targeted, some may never have been reported missing. Their disappearances may not have even been noticed. I hope that all of the children who died at the hands of Sidney Cook and his disgusting band of paedophiles are at peace, and the ones that survived have been able to rebuild their lives despite what these monsters did to them. Stephen Pauls is a British serial killer and serial rapist who murdered a minimum of 4 men between 2014 and 2015. However, he's known to have begun drugging and raping men from at least 2012. He met all of his victims through online dating applications, leading to him being dubbed the Grinder Killer. There are 2 sides to this story. First, the horrific crimes of Port, but also the inaction of the police, which meant that the victims' families were not taken seriously, and they suffered further pain outside of losing loved ones. Port was also free to kill and kill again. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Stephen Port was born on the 22nd of February 1975 in Southend, in the county of Essex, to Joan and Albert Port. He also had an older sister, Sharon. There's little information about Port's early upbringing, but no indications of abuse, although it's stated that his father had an issue with homosexuality, and therefore Port kept his attraction to males secret from his parents. Growing up, Port was described as being extremely isolated and considered strange by his classmates, and he was frequently bullied. One of his classmates described her interactions with Port, stating, quote, "He was quiet, shy and a loner, who sat on his own in class. The other class members were really not nice to him, and sometimes you could see the hurt on his face when they were really nasty. I was the only one that really talked to him because it wasn't right how he was treated. I told him to ignore them. We weren't really friends, as I myself found him a bit odd." After leaving school at the age of 16, Port went to art college, but it proved too expensive for his parents, and he spent 2 years training as a chef instead. Port was described as a strange man, and, despite his 6'5" frame, was extremely childlike, and even in adulthood was immature and liked to play with children's toys. Port lived at home with his parents until his early 30s, but in 2006 moved into his own property, 62 Cook Street in Barking, East London, where he committed his offences and will remain until his arrest years later. It's clear that Stephen Port struggled in the real world due to his awkwardness and general lack of social skills. However, on the internet, he could portray himself as anything he wanted to be and would spend all day, every day online, rarely leaving his flat. On the internet, he claimed to have been a graduate of Oxford University, served in the armed forces, and worked as a special needs teacher in London. None of this was true. It said Port worked for 13 years as a chef at West Ham Bus Depot and also did other work, such as door-to-door sales. Similarly, as opposed to being a balding man in his 30s, Port would post numerous pictures wearing a wig, clearly trying to make himself more attractive to other men, but also making himself look younger. As an aside, the television show Celebrity MasterChef had an episode filmed in West Ham bus station, and Stephen Port appears in the background, albeit briefly. This episode aired in mid-2014, so it was likely filmed earlier that year, or potentially in 2013, so before he committed the murders. However, by this point, he was already a rapist, and it must have been strange for everyone involved in this episode, knowing that they were standing mere feet away from a future serial killer. Anyway, it's clear that Port was a man obsessed with sex, specifically with younger men, and, At an inquest of one of his victims, it was revealed that he'd sent hundreds of thousands of messages to men on applications such as Grindr, and his neighbours noticed a revolving door of young-looking men going into his apartment. It got to the point where, due to how young the men looked, his neighbours were concerned Port was a paedophile. Port would also use drugs as part of his sexual activities with these men, specifically GHB, the drug originally developed as an anaesthetic, sometimes known simply as G. It's known to reduce inhibitions, increase libido, and sexual sensations become much more intense. It's commonly known as a, quote, date rape drug, due to its ability to cause unconsciousness and memory loss, and also because it's an odourless, colourless liquid that can be easily put in someone's drink without them noticing. However, it's also a highly dangerous drug, and in high enough doses can cause coma or even death. Also found on Port's laptop was obsessive viewing of, quote, date rape pornography, where he would watch scenarios, likely simulated, but potentially not, where men had sex with other men whilst one of them was unconscious. Port would watch hours of this material each and every day. It's clear that Port began to want to replicate this behaviour, and, by 2012, had put his plan into action. It's not clear how many men Stephen Port actually raped, but, in court, the earliest victim he was known to have attacked was a 19-year-old university student who Port met on Grindr in 2012. The pair chatted, and this male went to Port's flat, describing as being, quote, polite and friendly, and that, quote, nothing rang alarm bells. He was then given a glass of wine and noticed congealed powder in the bottom of the glass and immediately believed he'd been spiked. He then became dizzy and disorientated before losing consciousness. He had a vague recollection of being taken into the bedroom, undressed and raped by Port, but was unable to wake himself or fight back. This male was allowed to live and quickly left the property. It appears he was unsure whether what had happened was real or imagined, but when he got to university, he sought medical advice as he believed he'd been drugged. In January 2013, a man called the police and made an allegation that he'd been raped by Port on New Year's Eve 2012, and that he'd done this on several occasions before that. This male said that Port had plied him with drugs and alcohol to the point he was so under the influence he couldn't say no or fight back, and on each occasion, Port had anally raped him. It doesn't appear that Port was arrested for this allegation, and nothing came of it, although an entry was put on the police national computer database. The next victim was a male known only as B in court records. B was aged 20 when he met Stephen Port on a dating site for gay men. B went to Port's flat in Barking in June 2014 and stated that Port seemed, quote, a very nice guy. B was offered a drink and almost immediately fell unconscious. When he woke up, he was terrified and began shouting and screaming for help. Port, rather than calling ambulance, supported B whilst walking to Barking train station. B was in a terrible state, vomiting profusely and hardly able to stand. When they got to the station, they were seen by officers from the British Transport Police, who saw B incoherent, distressed and vomiting. Port told them that everything was okay and that B had just taken GHB. In court, it couldn't be proven that Port had actually raped B. However, even if this didn't occur, it was clearly the intention. In amongst the crimes against these two men, Port also repeatedly drugged and raped a male known only as C. A couple of things can be taken from this. Firstly, it's clear that Port was drugging men at least 2 years before he began committing the murders, with the intention of raping these individuals. This makes me certain he must have raped far more men than we know about, as it's unlikely that a man this obsessed with sex and heavily invested in date rape porn would have such large gaps between his offences. Unfortunately, there were likely significant issues of shame with these victims, who likely could not recall their attacks and potentially convince themselves that any physical injury they suffered was as a result of consensual sexual activity they could not remember. Others may have felt they could not report it for other reasons, i.e. already being in a relationship, or potentially they felt the police wouldn't take them seriously, which unfortunately given what happened after this point, seems to be a concern well founded. Secondly, the first victim referred to seeing powder in his drink. I think that Port was experimenting with different drugs for years to determine which would be the most effective at disabling his victims. GHB is a white crystalline powder in its raw form, but it's never normally solved this way. Instead, it's mixed with water to create a liquid solution. So whatever you put in the first victim's drink was something else. I think he then switched to GHB because it's harder to detect and potentially much more effective. Lastly, I think that Port saw the attack on B as a mistake, and that due to his screaming and crying out for help, he was forced to accompany him to the train station, and there he came across the police. I think that Port saw this as a close call, and he believed he needed to ensure this would never happen again. He needed to make sure his victims were completely under his control, with no chance of escaping. He could not risk being caught again walking the streets with someone he just drugged. So Port decided that these men would not leave his flat alive. Within days of the incident with B, Port was again on the prowl, and over the next year, he engaged in a campaign of rape and murder driven by his deviant and predatory sexual appetites. Stephen Port's first confirmed murder victim was 23-year-old Anthony Walgate. It wasn't pronounced Anthony. Anthony was 23 years old and originally from Hull, a city in East Yorkshire, but he moved down to London in order to attend fashion college. He was the son of a woman called Sarah Sack, a woman whose grit and determination is central to the eventual downfall of Stephen Port. Unfortunately, Anthony was struggling financially and so turned to escorting to make money. On the 17th of June 2014, he was contacted by Stephen Port, who arranged sexual services in exchange for payment of £800. It should be noted that Port had no personal savings, and therefore he clearly had no intention of paying Anthony. Anthony travelled to Barking Station, where the pair met at approximately 10:15 p.m, and then went back to Port's flat. What happened next is known only to Port, but it's clear that soon after arriving, Anthony was given a fatal dose of GHB, likely in the laced drink, and he fell unconscious. Whether Port raped him whilst he was alive, dying, or indeed dead is unclear. The next day, Port stayed in the flat with Anthony's body and then went to work a late shift. He returned at 4 a.m. on the 19th of June 2014 and, after dressing Anthony's body, dragged him outside, propping him up by a wall right next to the entrance to the flat complex. Port took Anthony's mobile phone so that their communications could not be seen, plunged a small bottle of GHB on his body, and then made the following anonymous 999 call.
Emergency ambulance. What's the address of the emergency?
It's Cook Street. There's a young boy. Looks like he's collapsed outside. I don't know.
Outside of which number?
4758.
Sorry?
4758, I think.
47 Cook Street.
Yeah.
What area?
Barking. It looks like he's collapsed or had a seizure or something. He's just always just drunk. But, yeah.
What's the telephone number you're calling from?
I'm just pulled up in the car. I've got to get my card on the parking.
That's right, don't worry about that. What's the telephone number you're calling from?
Just before 8 a.m. on the 19th of June 2014, paramedics and the police attended, and it was clear that Anthony was dead. Suspicions were raised almost immediately, as Anthony was in a sitting position cross-legged, with the paramedics who attended believing that if he'd have simply died from a seizure, he would not have been sat bolt upright. He would likely have slumped over. Also, it was clear that Anthony had been dead for some time. It appeared clear that he died somewhere else, been moved, and then posed. In addition, whilst a small detail, Anthony's underwear was on back to front, which his friends said was never something he would do due to being fashion conscious. At a later inquest, it appears the paramedics did raise their suspicions with the police, but nothing was acted upon. An autopsy showed that Anthony had died from a drug overdose. Sarah Sack was on holiday in Turkey when her son died, and she rushed back to the UK when she heard the news. Her contact with the police was appalling, with the initial phone call telling her son had died apparently lasting only a few minutes, and it was clear there was no investigation into her son's death. The family liaison officer assigned to her had apparently written that Anthony liked to drink and had, quote, dabbled in drugs, specifically cocaine, something Sarah vehemently denied later. Sarah battled the police for months, insisting that her son was murdered, and she criticised the behaviour of the Metropolitan Police in London. Port did eventually fall on the police's radar, as, although he'd taken Anthony's mobile, they were able to trace the number of the phone that made their 999 call. Also, Anthony had told a friend where he was going and who he was meeting. This led to Stephen Port being arrested on the 26th of June 2014. At this point, Port's story magically changed. Anthony had been in his property and they had arranged money for sex, but Anthony had then taken GHB in front of him and died. Port said, due to panicking, he dragged him outside, propped him up, and then called 999. Alarm bells should have been ringing. Port was clearly lying to the police on at least one occasion. Also, was the fact that Anthony had been dead for some time when he was found. He also had no history of using GHB, and if anyone had bothered to look into Port, they would have seen an allegation of rape against a male using drugs in 2012. However, none of this was done, and Port was only charged with perverting the course of justice due to making false reports to the police, and he was released on bail. Another major mistake was the police seized Port's laptop, but it was not examined for 10 months. If it had been checked before, they would have found multiple searches for date rape porn. Within 5 weeks, and while still on bail, Port committed his second murder. Gabriel Kovari was aged 22 and born in Slovakia, but moved to the UK in June 2014 for a better life. I was hoping to work for the NHS as a translator. Despite only being in the UK for less than 2 months, Gabriel saw the best and unfortunately the worst in people. He originally met a man called John Pape in July 2014. The pair developed a friendship as opposed to a relationship, and Gabriel moved in with him. Although their friendship only lasted 6 weeks, the pair became close. John was upset when on the 23rd of August 2014, Gabriel moved out, having told him he'd met a man online who'd offered him a place to stay. This man was Stephen Port. It's clear that Port had sexual intentions towards Gabriel as soon as he moved in, with him sending a text to a neighbour telling him he should come round and meet, quote, his new Slovakian twink flatmate, and that he was, quote, taking good care of him, suggesting there was more than just friendship going on between the pair. However, it appears that Gabriel soon regressed his decision, as he was not attracted to Port and had been sleeping on the sofa, but knew that Port would try to get him into bed. Sometime after 5 a.m, on the 25th of August 2014, Stephen Port administered a fatal dose of GHB in order to rape Gabriel. Port then took to covering his tracks, including using a false identity online, contacting Gabriel's friends, telling them that Gabriel had left the country. By chance, later in the day on the 25th of August 2014, Port's sister rang and later stated in court that her brother was distressed because there was a dead young man in his room. Port, the pathological liar that he appears to have been, later stated in court that the dead young man that he referred to in the conversation with his sister was Anthony Walgate, who had died over a month before, and that he was apparently having some sort of flashback. Absolute bollocks. Gabriel's body remained in the flat for some time, clearly whilst Port tried to figure out his next move. In the early hours of the 28th of August 2014, Port transported Gabriel's body, likely wrapped in a bedsheet, to St Margaret's Churchyard, approximately 500 metres away from his home. He then placed Gabriel against a wall in a sitting position. Port posed him, placing a pair of sunglasses on his face so someone who saw him at a distance would think he was just asleep. At around 6 a.m. that day, so a few hours later, a woman called Barbara Denham was walking her dogs past a graveyard where she saw a young man sat up against a wall who she thought was asleep. She called out, but there was no response. She then went up to him and touched him, and concerned that he may have been dead, called the police. Again, a bottle of GHB had been plastered on Gabriel's body. Police attended, and it was clear that Gabriel was dead. For some inexplicable reason, the death was determined to not be suspicious, with them assuming that Gabriel had accidentally taken a fatal dose of GHB and simply died where he was found. No post-mortem was conducted, and Gabriel's body was released to his family overseas for burial. John Pate was informed of the death of his friend and was in shock. He had no indication that Gabriel was a drug user, and he raised his concerns about the conclusions drawn by the police. He pointed out the similarities between the death of Gabriel and Anthony Walgate. Specifically, how strange it was that two young men should die of an overdose of the same drug within 500 metres of each other in less than 2 months. The police ignored his concerns. The police also stonewalled Sarah Sack, who was still trying to be heard about her son. She too had heard about the death of Gabriel and was convinced that there was a link to her son's death. Of course, she was correct. But she was ignored. So Stephen Port was in the clear and free to kill again and to claim his third victim. Daniel Whitworth was a 23-year-old chef who had his whole life ahead of him. He lived with his partner, but unfortunately was also using dating websites for gay men. And on the 18th of September 2014, he travelled to Barking train station and met with Port, and the pair went back to his flat. Sometime over the next few hours, Daniel was administered with a fatal dose of GHB and raped. Whilst Daniel lay dead in the property, Port began to cover his tracks. He deleted his dating profile and wrote an apparent suicide note, which he then planted on Daniel's body before, under the cover of darkness on the evening of the 19th of September 2014, he took Daniel's body to the same graveyard where he dumped Gabriel's remains. The next morning, a dog walker found his body. Not just any dog walker, Barbara Denham, the same woman who found the body of Gabriel a month before. She later reported her utter disbelief at being confronted by the same situation again. She approached Daniel's body, which was again propped up against the wall, touched his stomach, felt that he was cold, and then called the police for a second time, saying she'd found a body. The body of Daniel was literally 5 feet away from the spot where Gabriel's body had been found. Police attended and determined there was nothing that could be done for Daniel. Again, he was found with a bottle of GHB on him, but if they bothered to check, they would have found Port's DNA on his jacket from where he'd been redressed after being murdered. They also found an apparent suicide note, which read, quote, "I'm sorry everyone, mostly to my family, but I can't go on anymore. I took the life of my friend, Gabriel Klein. We was just having some fun at a mate's place, and I got carried away and gave him another shot of G. I didn't notice while we was having sex, he had stopped breathing. I tried to get him to start breathing again, but it was too late. It was an accident, but I blame myself for what happened. I didn't tell my family I went out. I know I would go to prison if I went to the police. I can't do that to my family, and at least this way, I can at least be with Gabriel again. I hope he will forgive me. By the way, please do not blame the guy I was with last night. We only had sex, then I left. He knows nothing of what I've done. I've taken what G I have left with sleeping pills, so if these kill me, it's what I deserve. Feeling dizzy now, as took 10 minutes ago, so hoping you understand my writing. I dropped my phone on my way here, so it should be in the grass somewhere." This whole situation, but especially the note, should have been a massive red flag. Firstly, you have 3 young men, all found dead within 500 metres of each other, 2 of them mere feet apart, in the space of 2 months, none of whom were known to be regular users of GHB. If proper checks had been done, they would have found it odd that Daniel apparently was so bereft at killing his good friend Gabriel that he got his surname wrong, calling him Klein instead of Kavari. Also, they would have found the whole situation very odd, considering that Daniel had never even met Gabriel, and there was no evidence they even knew of each other's existence. Also, what an oddly phrased suicide note, with the man apparently in the throes of grief and utter despair that he'd taken the life of his friend, but he takes time to mention the man he just had sex with and says not to blame him. Blame him for what? Why even mention that at all? Clearly mention of sexual activity between Gabriel and Daniel in this note was to make the police think that any evidence of this would be explained. In addition, if they'd bothered to check the phone records of Gabriel and Daniel, they would have seen they were nowhere near each other on the date that Gabriel died. Clearly, Stephen Port thought he was very clever, trying to pin Gabriel's murder on Daniel, but this note is amateur hour for the reasons I've mentioned, and this should have launched a major investigation due to the overwhelming evidence that a serial killer was operating in the area. But nothing happened. Sarah Sack was still fighting for justice for her son, but was also now fighting for the families of both Gabriel Kavari and Daniel Whitworth. The families united and continued to put pressure on the police to take things seriously and actually investigate crimes, but they were all ignored. However, there is shocking evidence of very underhanded tactics employed by the police. In particular, in the case of Daniel's death, police records claim that the handwriting in the suicide note was confirmed as being a match to Daniel by his family, something they stated never happened. So the police chalked his death up to a suicide and made no attempts to investigate further. Stephen Port apparently did not kill again for a year, but he continued to drug and rape other men. He attacked at least 3 men, known as males D, E and F. Male D was extremely vulnerable. He met Port in January 2015 and had his drink spiked at his flat and was then raped. Port filmed the rape, then showed it to D, who was obviously horrified. At this point, there's a gap of a few months in Port's offending, but this is only because he finally went to court for perverting the court of justice related to the death of Anthony Walgate. On the 23rd of March 2015, Port was sent to prison for 8 months for this offence. The court had no idea the man they were sending down for this simple offence had killed at least 2 people and raped multiple men. Port was released on June the 4th, 2015, and within a month had attacked another man. This was E, who was 35 years old and who met Port on Grindr in July 2015. By this point, Port appears to have been experimenting with different ways to drug men, and so, with the pair were at his flat, Port used a syringe to inject drugs straight into the anus of E. E felt a burning, painful sensation and immediately knew something was wrong. He got up, dressed, and left. Male F was already known to Port, and they reconnected via Grindr in September 2015. Again, F went to his flat, but he made it clear he did not wish to do any drugs. Under the pretense of applying lubrication, Port again injected drugs directly into F's anus. He felt a burning sensation and started to feel lightheaded, but luckily did not fall unconscious and was able to escape. Why Port let these men live is unclear, but I think that even he knew that he got away with things up to this point and that he couldn't risk having another dead body on his hands. However, his murderous impulses took over and he would claim another victim soon afterwards. Jack Taylor was a 25-year-old man who lived with his parents in Dagenham and worked as a forklift driver. On the 12th of September 2015, Jack went out drinking with his friends. He then went home and accessed Grindr and began speaking to Port, and they agreed to meet at Barking train station. This haunting CCTV footage shows the pair meeting and walking back to Port's flat, essentially Jack's last walk. I don't know about you, but there's part of me that just wants to shout, telling Jack to stop and go home, however ridiculous that might sound. What happened in Port's flat will never be known for certainty, but it's clear that Jack was drugged and raped and was dead by 7:30 a.m, so around 4 hours after meeting Port, as he then began covering his tracks, deleting the Grindr app from both his and Jack's phone in order to delete the messages. Jack's body remained in the flat the entire day of the 13th of September 2015, and when it got dark, Port again carried or dragged his body to the same graveyard where he disposed of his last 2 victims. He placed Jack's body propped against a wall, again just a few feet away from where he dumped Gabriel and Daniel, but this time on the opposite side of the wall. Port planted a bottle of GHB on Jack, as well as a syringe, and took his phone, dumping it. Jack's body was found by a passerby, this time not the same dog walker as before, and the police were called. Again, stunningly, they appeared to take the evidence at face value and determined that Jack had probably taken a fatal overdose, potentially accidentally. Case closed. Jack's family were informed of his passing and were adamant that something was wrong. They stated that Jack had aspirations of becoming a police officer and so was very firmly anti-drug. It got to the point where Jack's family were doing their own investigation, compiling their own handwritten evidence and sending it to the police. However, they, like Sarah Sack, who was still banging down every door and calling everyone she could, were ignored, with the police stating there was no reason to link Jack's passing to any of the 3 previous deaths in the last 16 months. It appears that Stephen Port was caught by chance in the end. A detective reviewing the death of Anthony Walgate happened to see the CCTV footage of Jack Taylor walking from Barking train station with a male. When this detective looked at the footage, he realised the person walking with Jack was Stephen Port, a man who'd been involved in the case of Anthony. At this point, the pieces finally fell into place, with links being made with all the victims and Port, and his background was properly checked and the content of his laptop reviewed. A new team of investigators were assigned, and finally, on the 15th of October 2015, Stephen Port was arrested on suspicion of 4 counts of murder. He was interviewed the next day, and whilst he didn't go no comment, he gave very little truthful information. I've included the full release clip of the interview, which is 11 minutes long, as I think it's fascinating, but also people who like analysing body language will have plenty of material. If you want to skip it, as I said, it's about 11 minutes long.
So did you have any involvement in the death of the male that we just spoke about a short while ago, Gabriel Cavari or Gabriel Klein?
No, I didn't know.
So, were you involved in administering any drugs or poisons or noxious substances to him?
No, I don't administer drugs to anyone or give drugs to anyone. That's done at the party by someone else. The name I recognised, one of the boys you mentioned before, was is normally at the parties and deals with administrating drugs.
Who's that, sorry?
Daniel. Recognised him. Sometimes he deals, he hands out the drugs to the guests.
Daniel, this is the male,
yeah,
that we spoke of earlier.
So, it might not be the same guy, I really don't know. But is the only Daniel I'd know. Or, I mean, I've spoken to him a couple of times at the party, remembering his name. He does, like when I did, Scott would ask him to pick up guys, take them to the party, and he would stay, but he would stay and minister or do out hand out drugs, whatever. But I would leave, or he would stay.
And did you go with Daniel to meet people?
No, I knew he was doing the same as I was, but I'd see him at the party and there's a brief conversation with him about it. But I've never actually engaged with him outside of the place.
Outside of a party? And which parties were these?
She's got called the fat parties.
Scots parties.
Yeah.
The fat party.
Fat party. F-R-A-T.
Frat parties. So when was the first occasion that you met the person that you're talking of, someone that you know as Daniel?
I think I was on the first few occasions I was there. It was the first time I photographed for Scott, and Daniel was there. So I don't even know if it is the same Daniel I was talking about, but it's the only Daniel I can recall as such. I think his name was Whitworth. It rings a bell, but
You think his name was Whitworth?
I mean, if he's tall, almost as tall as me, with brown hair, slim.
Might help if I show your picture. We'll call this CRT 2. This is Jack Taylor. Do you recognise that, mate?
No. No, I just don't recognise him. No. I don't pay full attention to the guys' faces when I have paid attention to the parties. But I don't recognise his face.
So you don't recognise his face?
I do not know. No.
And I mean, that's Jack Taylor, so you don't recognise
No, I don't.
Jack Taylor?
No.
So, have you ever slept with this male?
No.
Had sexual intercourse with him?
He doesn't look like the type I would go with myself.
He's not the sort of person you'd go for?
No, I tend to more. It's more younger, drinky boys, more younger boys, but not. He looks older. He could be similar to the type I've taken to parties, but I don't recognise him as being one of them.
So you don't recognise him as being one of them?
No.
No. Okay. And Jack, again, was found dead. This was on the 14th of September, 2015. Stephen, did you have any involvement in his death?
I did not know. No.
Did you kill Jack Taylor?
Did not know. No.
Did you administer any drugs or noxious substances to him?
I did not know.
With the intention of causing him harm?
No. Definitely not.
No. And you say you've never seen him before? Is that right?
That's right.
That's right. Okay, I've got another map here, CRT8. I'm just trying to show you as many maps of the area because it's not easy to get it all on one piece of paper, just so that we're clear really. And again, it shows your home address, and it shows the church St Margaret, and behind it you've got the abbey and the primary school. In particular, the area around the walls of the abbey. Have you ever had any reason to go into that area?
No.
Have you ever been through into the abbey?
No, I haven't. No. No, I don't generally go to the church areas. No. No. I think I once went to that church with my ex-Danny. Went to the church on a Christmas day. and into the church, but that's as far as I got. As far as
You've not been into the grounds behind it, where you've got the old abbey walls.
No, gosh.
No grounds there.
No, what's the spooky side? I won't go there.
You've never been in there.
No.
In all the 8 years that you've lived across the road from the park.
I thought it was all private. I wouldn't go there. I think it's a private area. It belongs to the church.
It's fairly open, isn't it, when you go past? Would you agree with that or not?
And the field's, the field is, but the church bit behind the walls, we won't go past there.
Because 3 of the 4 people that have been found dead were found slumped up against the wall here of the abbey. Pardon?
Yeah, I didn't know that.
You didn't know that? So that's news to you, is it? Did you put them there?
No.
So obviously Anthony was found slumped outside your address with a large amount of GHB in his system. The other 3 men we've been discussing were all found over by the wall area of the abbey. We can see on the map. Again, all of them were slumped against the wall with a large amount of GHB in their body. Can you account for that at all?
No, I can't.
I mean, Stephen, did you write this letter here, CRT 11?
No, I didn't.
The photos of it that's found with Daniel.
I fear not.
Are you telling us the truth, Stephen?
I'm telling you the truth, yes.
About the letter?
Yes. 100% truth.
About all of these boys?
Yeah.
Young boys? In the early stages of their youth, really, in terms of in their early 20s. All found dead. Stephen?
Yeah, I understand, but...
Close to your house. One of them had been in your house, either just before or at the time when he died, and was found to have large quantities of a drug in his system. The other 3 were all found just over the road in the churchyard, or just beside the churchyard in that area that we've discussed, propped up against a wall, short distance from your house, all again with high levels of GHB in them, enough to kill them. Highly unusual way to die for one person. This is 4 all found very close to where you live. All men, young men, type of men that you say that you find attractive. All now dead, Stephen.
As it happened, Anthony, I know nothing about the other 3, how they come to be.
Stephen, this is serious.
Yes, I know.
Okay. It's really important that you tell us the absolute truth.
You've told yourself always true.
Stephen Port pleaded not guilty to all offences and, in October 2016, went on trial at the Old Bailey in London. Port tied himself in knots, and his claims changed rapidly, with him saying that he didn't know the victims, to admitting that he did, and then saying that they were in his flat and that apparently all of them had taken overdoses of GHB in front of him. The court did not believe him, and Stephen Port was found guilty of the murders of Anthony Walgate, Gabriel Cavari, Daniel Whitworth, and Jack Taylor. He was also found guilty of drugging with the intention of raping, or actually raping, 7 men between 2012 and 2015. On the 25th of November 2016, Stephen Port was set for sentencing before Mr. Justice Openshaw, who, whilst running through Port's long list of offences, stated, quote, "Self-evidently, the defendant is highly dangerous." He then sentenced him. Justice Openshaw stated, quote, "I had no doubt that the seriousness of the offending is so exceptionally high that the whole life order is justified. Indeed, it is required. The sentence, therefore, upon the counts of murder is a sentence of life imprisonment. A decline to set a minimum term. The result is a whole life sentence, and the defendant will die in prison. Therefore, Stephen Port joined the list of prisoners in the UK who will never be released. To this day, he continues to maintain his innocence for his offences." After Stephen Port was caught, and due in large part to the victims' families, the Metropolitan Police referred itself to the Independent Office for Police Conduct, the IOPC, and an investigation was launched. The police looked at the involvement of 17 officers involved in Stephen Port's case and found that 9 had demonstrated performance which had, quote, "fallen below the standard required." They were reprimanded for, quote, "performance failings, but allowed to remain in service." And, to add insult to injury, in 2021, the Metropolitan Police confirmed that 5 of these officers had been promoted. The coroner's inquest stated that inaction in the investigation of Anthony Walgate's death, quote, "probably contributed to the deaths of the other 3 men." In June 2022, the IOPC stated they would be launching a fresh inquiry into the police's handling of the Stephen Port case, but given that the original investigation took 2 years, there'll be no answers quickly, and by the time a report is published, potentially these same officers will have been promoted again. I think the term "probably" is indicative of British culture, with us being very polite and not wishing to offend. I'll leave it to my viewers to determine what they think, but I would say the police failings definitely led to Port being allowed to kill and rape people after his first murder. All of the victims' families and friends accused Metropolitan Police of institutional homophobia. They also pointed out how inevitably the police would have handled this case differently if the 4 victims had been women. I think it's horrific that the family and friends of these young men had to basically put their grief aside in order to become detectives, because the people whose job it actually was to do this were so useless. Total respect then. So, what could be said about Stephen Port? What was the thinking of this serial murderer? I think that ultimately Port's behaviour was driven by inadequacy. He was a man who had poor social skills, a menial job, and, at quite a young age, was losing his hair. These are clearly things that Port wasn't able to come to terms with, so he had to project lies about success on the internet and walk around with a wig in order to project the man he wanted to be, not the person he was. The internet was his escape. On there, he could be anyone he wanted. He could feel a sense of belonging and acceptance, likely from the thousands of men he interacted with online. It's common for men and women who have significant issues with their self-esteem to use sex as a way to make themselves feel better temporarily. In these moments, they feel wanted, and temporarily they can forget about how they actually feel. Chasing this feeling can become addictive, and it's clear that this was the case with Stephen Port. While Stephen Port is known as the Grindr Killer, he used around 10 different dating websites and apps and was obsessed with filling his life with sexual encounters, which I think were an escape from his daily life. I think that Port being described as childlike is also a relevant part to understanding him. As a child, we are taught self-control and that we can't have everything we want. Port appears to have learnt neither of these things. However, I think that as time went on, this didn't have the same impact on Port. The high of meeting random men for sex was starting to wane. He needed to escalate his behaviour. Port became obsessed with rape pornography. I think watching this gave him an idea of how to use sex to have control over another human being and he started to replicate what he'd seen. He also took people's lives, which was the ultimate demonstration of his power over them. I imagine that Paul was most likely ecstatic going through the list of men online, thinking about who he could have sex with their level of consent meaning nothing. They were just objects to use and abuse. When he met them, it didn't matter that he had extremely poor social skills, or was very odd, or wore a wig. They wouldn't live long enough to mock him about these things. He was in complete control. Once he had finished with one victim, he dumped them like rubbish, before moving on and looking for more men to drug, rape and murder. Watching footage of Stephen Port makes me realise just how good Stephen Merchant's performance was in the 2022 series called 4 Lives, which, if you can find it, is well worth a watch. I think it's still on BBC iPlayer. In my opinion, Stephen Merchant perfectly captures the strange, lumbering demeanour of Port, but also hints at something else, especially during the court scenes, extreme violence and anger. And I think deep within Port, despite his quiet and shy demeanour, is a core of anger and violent tendencies which he had no desire to control. Stephen Port is inevitably a psychopath, and, if released, I have no doubt he would keep killing. However, he'll never get the chance, as Stephen Port's life will end behind prison bars. So, what are your thoughts?